The priest in the middle of the church was distracted from his thoughts by a man who burst in and opened the door, shouting in a panic that the man was already here. He continued to run towards the priest, waving his arms and shouting that it was no longer safe and they should run away. However, the priest did not show any signs of panic, but simply asked the frightened monk who he was talking about. He asked in a trembling voice if he had not heard the rumors about Humite Street. Then, shuddering even more, he said that the man he called the Leakin Killer, Vampire Slayer, and Lord of the Blue Devils was on his way here with his army of undead. After which he continued, he added that he would not let the Dark Order leave so easily, and would kill them in the most brutal way. However, the priest only laughed after hearing the monk's words, and smiling, he replied that they had nothing to worry about. Since they had the best order of holy knights with them, whose squad was considered the strongest in the entire empire. However, the monk heard this even more in a panic of understanding what will happen to him, grabbed his head, then answered the priest that the knights he was talking about had already become undead and were on their way here. In the middle of the crowd of knights who were no longer living people, there was a guy with a blue aura emanating from him. With a gloating grin on his face, he raised his hand, then created a cross of light, in the center of which was a circle. This sign began to glow bright blue light. At the same time the guy ordered his army of undead to move forward, following the bright beam of light that came out of the cross and directing the army, who followed the order with fierce roars, rushed towards their target. At the same time, the priests who were standing inside the church talking suddenly heard some noise. When they turned around, they were horrified to see the shadows of many hands pounding on the glass in an attempt to break it and break in. As expected, the glass could not withstand such an onslaught, and the next moment it cracked. The last barrier separating the priests from their deaths was shattered. In the next second, the army of undead, which no longer had anything blocking its way, rushed inside with a fierce roar, chasing after the priests, who began to flee in panic. However, they were unable to do so, as the zombies immediately caught up with them and threw them to the ground, preventing them from moving. The monk who had informed the priest of the impending danger, lying on the ground pinned by the undead, began to beg for mercy. Unfortunately, the undead zombies did not understand human speech, which led to the fact that these words were his last. At the same time, the priest, who had not yet become a zombie, was looking at something with horror. Coming down the stairs was a guy with a gun on his shoulder, who even despite his seemingly young age looked particularly horrifying in this environment. Unable to look at it any longer, the priest turned around and started trying to crawl away, unable to believe that the guy was controlling the undead, even though it was supposed to be serving them, namely the necromancers. His escape was never successful, however, as the next moment someone's foot stepped on his arm, causing severe pain. Glaring angrily at the guy to whom the foot belonged, the priest told him that no matter how hard he tried to stop them, God would still grant salvation to their souls. Salvation, retorted the boy contemptuously, holding the gun to the priest's head. I'll do it instead, said the guy, whereupon his weapon began to glow with a bright blue light. The priest lying on the ground, with tears in his eyes, felt the divine power seeping into his skin, while the darkness that was inside him began to come out of him. The next moment, with the words that the God's blessing would take him to hell, he pulled the trigger. The blue light from the muzzle illuminated everything around him, starting a new legend about the youngest necromancer. Let's go back to the beginning of our story, which began much earlier. In the luxurious castle that belonged to the holy emperor who ruled this kingdom, were heard gossiping two servants, one of whom began to tell his interlocutor the latest rumors that he had heard about the second prince, who from his words was a disgrace to the kingdom. To them he was the bottom of humanity without moral principles, and they could not believe how such a man could be born in a kingdom ruled by a holy emperor. Then remembering the incident with the archbishop, in which the prince harassed his daughter, which resulted in punishment. However, the guy didn't put up with it, instead of just accepting the punishment, decided to take revenge and spoiled the archbishop's chambers. Hearing of this, the holy emperor, who could no longer tolerate the antics of his son, banished him to the land of the dead spirits, so that he could finally think about his misdeeds and finally come to his senses. But that didn't do any good. After all, the guy started doing dirty deeds again, which eventually led to the fact that he tried to commit suicide after the girl's refusal. However, he somehow managed to survive. The biggest oddity was not that he managed to survive, but that after that incident it was as if he had become a completely different person. To everyone's surprise, he changed for the better. He began to work hard in the monastery, helped the needy, was a model teenager who could be set as an example, and generally stopped making trouble for himself. After this change, many people in the city began to like him, but even more began to treat him with suspicion, as he suddenly changed beyond recognition, which could not help but look suspicious. These suspicions led to rumors and opinions that a demon had entered the prince's body after he had committed blasphemy, or that the prince had made a contract with a demon. Others told of seeing a corpse walking around the monastery. All in all, rumors abounded. "What do you think?" asked the guy, turning to the two zombies who sat in front of him, hoping to get honest answers from them. The zombies who possessed intelligence that was capable of conquering the world, and communicating in a language that was inaccessible to mere mortals, with a clever look something growled in his language. The prince stared at the zombie, wondering what he should do. A hologram window of his condition was displayed above his head. It indicated that the guy was 16-year-old Alan Alphals. In addition, the status window indicated that he was the exiled 7th prince, and that he belonged to the Necromancer class. While the zombies, who were completely aware of this world, looked at their master, the prince, wondering why the status window was appearing by itself, closed it with a wave of his hand. Then scratching his head he turned to the zombies who were sitting in front of him on their knees, said that he thought that someone had seen them walking here, which was the reason for the rumors. He added with a sigh that if this continued he would be falsely accused of hereticism, and besides he was no longer the real Alan Alphals. Before that, he was just an ordinary person from Korea, but then he suddenly became the worthless son of the Holy Emperor. When he woke up in his new body, he found himself hanging from a noose. Fortunately, however, the rope broke, which was his salvation. He then discovered that he could see system windows, but that wasn't the only new ability he had. As it turned out, he also possessed the abilities of a necromancer, which helped him to fulfill his duties as a cemetery keeper. Unfortunately, here, people with such abilities were called heretics. Even the zombies were sad to hear the news. As Alan looked at the zombies that were sitting obediently on his lap and looked at him with their intelligent eyes, he thought about how at first he couldn't make sense of everything that had come upon him, but now he was beginning to understand what was going on. The question before him was whether he should have continued. They had actually worked well together at first. He had a zombie grave digger and a zombie burying zombie, which together managed to do a pretty good job in the cemetery. Everything was going so well that they could even afford to relax and enjoy the rest after a great day's work. However, now it was probably time for them to say goodbye. Hearing this, the zombies began to panic. One of them clutched his head in confusion, not knowing what he would do now. The second expressed his displeasure by trying to rebel, while the third began to cry from despair. Alan, not wanting to see all this, ordered them to calm down. Then turning to the blue-eyed zombie, he told him to wipe the foam on his rebellious mouth. Picking up the shovel, he added that he just wanted to say that he had a difficult first life, which he would tell about a little later. And that's why he would like to live his second life quietly and peacefully, he finished, holding the shovel in front of him, while behind him appeared the face of some magical clock that glowed bright blue. However, all was not yet lost for the zombie, as the guy shining like some kind of saint with a bright light that could only be seen through sunglasses, he added with a smile on his face in a soothing voice that since they were pretty close, he would think about it. "Deal?" he asked, making his usual face. To which the zombies, touched by his kindness, gave him a thumbs up in agreement. "Then let's get to work," said the guy to the excited zombies so they wouldn't relax after the good news. "Did you hear that?" the man with the mask on his face asked his companion worriedly. When he continued driving the cart with two blue corpses with bags on their heads, he irritatedly told him to stop talking and help him push the cart. Adding that if he didn't, they would probably end up like the corpses in the cart. "Let's hurry up and go to the prince and ask him to help this damned village," the man added in a grim voice. As it turned out, this seemingly harmless village was not so simple. In the crack of the open wooden door, where someone's face, which like the hair was pale white in color, was looking outward. There was a blood-red eye, staring outward with a mad look. "Are these the last corpses?" Alan asked the men, looking at the two blue-haired corpses with bags over their heads, over which flies were flying. To which the black-haired man replied that it seemed so, while the red-haired man confirmed his partner's words, adding that many of them had died, while the rest had simply fled. Then turning to the prince, who had already removed the sack from the corpse's head, the men asked him if he could come to the village. He turned around and asked them why it was necessary. The two men excitedly started gesticulating with their hands and began to talk about how almost all the villagers had been wiped out, adding that they would be safer with the prince, as they were probably fine because they saw him often while they were carrying the corpses. To which the stone-faced man thought to himself that a blasphemous prince like him didn't have that kind of power. The men, however, did not give up, but even went on the offensive, using one of the dirtiest tricks of all, tearfully begging him to help them. Clinging to the prince, they tearfully began to ask him what would happen to them if they also fell ill, and besides, who would then transport the corpses to him. Indeed, there might be a problem with the supply of corpses, as there aren't many people I can trust. Looks like I'll have to save this village, for the sake of innocent souls who don't deserve to die, of course. The medieval village, whose houses were made of wood, was immersed in a gloomy atmosphere. Walking along the road between the houses, Alan also noticed that the village looked really scary. The two men behind him and following at his heels looked even more frightened, even though this was their hometown. Alan clutched the shovel tightly and held it out in front of him, looking around as he cautiously moved forward. One of them tearfully warned the prince to be careful, because the waterworks had stopped working, and deep puddles had formed all over the city. The boy turned around irritably and told them to take their hands off him. The man complainingly replied that they should have a blessing on them at all times. Alan was not quite satisfied with being a mascot. Continuing on his way, he told the men that if he were them, he would spend his time searching another house. Hearing a noise, Alan turned his head and asked in surprise what it was. The men, hearing nothing, asked in surprise what he was saying, and asked him not to be frightened again. But the man, despite the warnings of his companions, believing in his hearing, went into the alley with a shovel in his hand, saying that he would check what was there. Leaving the men behind, and walking down the alley, Alan noted with annoyance that he had a bad feeling. His instincts told him that something was here, and that something felt like a slight presence, like the aura of an assassin. A sudden sound behind him made him turn around sharply. However, as it turned out, it was a simple mouse that had crawled out of its burrow and was quietly squeaking. Alan looked at it and thought happily to himself that it was an ordinary rat. However, when the next moment its eyes turned red and veins swelled on its face, he realized that it was far from that. The zombie rat wasn't just one, it was an army of them. Which in the next moment furious rushed at the confused guy who did not quite understand what was happening. Many small rats with red eyes began to climb up Alan's clothes, trying to bite him. With a violent swing of his shovel, which sent the rats flying in different directions, the guy finally realized why the village was in such a state. Then he swung his shovel again, which gave off a blue glow. He cursed the rats and slammed it into the ground. A small crater was formed at the spot where lightning crackled, and around it lay the defeated zombie rats. The rag that had flown away from the impact, which had been his mask earlier, landed on Alan's face. However, the zombie rats didn't like this trick, and seeing the death of their fellow rats, they rushed at the giant in front of them. Alan, realizing what a mistake he had made by killing those rats, and realizing how it could end for him, panicked and shouted at the zombie rats that he didn't mean to do it, and it wasn't on purpose. However, there was no stopping them. Having thrown the guy on the ground, they began to climb on him trying to bite him. The drama of the situation was added by the fact that the shovel, which had been given to him by Lloyd himself, as well as the weapon to which he was ready to entrust his life, flew off and sank into a puddle. The next moment, however, it began to emit a bright blue glow. While the prince was yelling at the rats trying to get in touch with them and negotiate, the water in the puddle turned from dark and dirty to crystal clear and began to sparkle with sunlight, even though it was cloudy and the sun was not visible. At the next moment, under the perplexed gaze of Alan, who did not understand what was happening, a stream of crystal clear water rose from the puddle, which grabbed the zombie rats and lifted them into the air, after which a notification window appeared in front of him, stating that the swamp death skill had been applied. Being doused with his own water that cleansed the mice and rained down on the ground, Alan, who didn't really understand what had happened, was confused and wondered what swamp was being talked about. At the same time his faithful companions, who at last dared to look into the alley, saw the prince sitting on the ground, and wondered why there were so many rats around. When they came closer, however, they were surprised to find that the muddy water in the puddle had turned into holy water. This miracle delighted the men, after which they began to ask Alan questions about how he had managed to do it and to cleanse the rats, noting that they were probably the source of the disease. He wanted to know how he had done it, however. Taking the shovel out of the puddle and cursing the prince who was the master of the body before him, he told himself that he had just learned that he could use something other than zombie summoning. Since he had never used that skill before, his first question was, could that one really purify? After some thought, he came to the conclusion that since his body was filled with holy power, because he was the grandson of a holy emperor, that's why his skill became holy. And as contradictory as it sounds, he could be a holy necromancer. And that's probably why the zombies were relatively good-natured. However, Alan's musings were interrupted by a noise. On the other side of the puddle of holy water stood a girl with blonde hair. Seeing her, both men were puzzled and surprised, as they thought that everyone had died there. As it turned out, the girl's name was Charlotte, and she lived in a neighboring house. Waving to the girl, one of the men told her to go to them, asking her where her parents were, and the second man, following the example of the first, told her that he thought she was all right. But the girl was not as harmless as she might have seemed at first sight, for in her right hand she held a large butcher knife. In the next moment, having covered several meters in a split second, she stabbed each of the men, and with glowing red eyes she appeared right in front of Alan. Despite the unexpected attack, the boy managed to block the knife, though with difficulty. Feeling the full force of the blow, from which even the handle of the shovel was cracked, Alan realized that such power could not be possessed by an ordinary girl, suggesting that she could be a zombie. However, after scaring her away to a safe distance, he immediately rejected this theory, because ordinary zombies could not use objects. Therefore, the only option left was that she had not completely turned into a zombie. The girl clenched her teeth and tears flowed from her red eyes, and she also started to make sounds like growling, which seemed to be trying to form the word mom. Alan, who was watching all this, looked at the girl with astonishment, who even managed to form a few more words, asking where her daddy was. The next moment, however, she rushed at the boy again with a knife in her hands in an attempt to stab him, but luckily Alan managed to block the attack with the shovel again. However, this time the place where the knife and the handle of the shovel came into contact with each other began to glow with a bright blue light. Seeing this, the girl's eyes widened in bewilderment. At the same time, Alan noticed that the girl's hands began to burn from contact with his holy water. Deciding that he could no longer continue to hurt her, he decided to end the girl's suffering by pushing her right into the puddle of holy water. Then he pinned her to the ground, not letting her get out. The girl, after coming into contact with the holy water, began to scream painfully and violently, trying to push the guy off her. He held her with all his strength and told her to be patient, as there were no other options for her to turn back into a human being. The girl's resistance and her desperate screams continued. But at some point they subsided and the girl's body was slowly submerged in the sacred water. The tired and wet Alan looked tiredly before him. Where in the puddle of holy water that shimmered with blue light lay a beautiful girl with white hair, who was already fully human, and who looked straight into the sky with her eyes. Her beautiful eyes remained red. A number of villagers came to see Alan sitting in one of the rooms reading a book. They told him that they had heard the news that he had been able to clear out a large pack of rats that had invaded the village. Then adding that they had also heard that he had been able to save a girl named Charlotte, they asked him to help them as well. To which Alan replied that he had not saved anyone. Then closing the book and looking at the crowd, he announced that the girl was dead. When the old man heard the prince's words, he asked Alan, who was sitting in the church pew, if the girl was really dead. He turned and asked the villagers in front of him how they thought he should save people. He added that even though he had the blood of a holy emperor in him, he had no special skills to realize it. After these words, the atmosphere among the residents changed from hopeful to disappointed and sad. Some sadly wondered what they would do with their village, while others were disappointed that despite the long journey they had made, they were unable to get the salvation they had hoped for. Unable to bear the sad situation any longer, Alan sighed. Then he turned to the people who had arrived and asked from whom they had heard that he was rescuing people. Someone in the crowd wanted to answer, but he was interrupted by the voice of a torn man who ran into the hall and immediately called loudly for the prince. Then with a carefree and joyful smile on his face he announced that Charlotte was awake. He added in a delighted voice that it was all thanks to the prince, and then began to say that he had told the girl to go back to sleep, but when he saw the crowd of people looking at him he fell silent. Finally noting that it looked like the prince had a lot of guests. At the same time the eyes of the crowd shifted from the man to Alan. Now that the truth had been revealed, everyone looked at him with angry expressions on their faces. Alan, realizing that his plan had failed, made an annoyed face and said so be it. Standing up from the bench and addressing the villagers, he said that he had no choice, as he had more divine power than they did, thinking to himself about how he had been set up by Grill and his long tongue. While the villagers couldn't understand what was wrong with the prince who was changing his mind so quickly. However, the next moment he put his index finger up and added that he had a few conditions. When Alan looked at the old man, right above him he could see a system window that displayed basic information about the old man. If the information was to be believed, his name was Parlock, he was 75 years old, and he had specialties such as gossip, farmer, and trickster. Emotionally, it said he was now full of suspicion. Such information was just right for the prince. However, he was a little surprised that even though they were asking for help, they didn't want to trust him. Was he really such a bad prince? Without dwelling on it, he turned to the villagers, saying that the condition was quite simple. Namely that he wanted money or food in exchange for his work. He also demanded that they repair the cathedral. When the people heard about the repair of the cathedral, they immediately asked if they had to repair the whole cathedral. Seeing that they weren't motivated enough, Alan replied that if they didn't want to do it, they didn't have to do it, since he didn't like the deal very much either. However, the old man, seeing that the guy was not simple, immediately replied that they were in agreement. Alan did not stop there, however, and said that he had one more important condition, and hearing this the atmosphere in the cathedral became gloomy, for no one expected that the boy would ask for so much. However, to their joy and surprise, he simply told them not to say anything about their agreement to the holy knights. Hearing this, the villagers replied that they agreed to the terms. Standing behind the departing people who were talking to each other about how the prince was a fraud and profited from the problems of others, Alan happily thought to himself that the cathedral for exile would finally become useful. Then he remembered the words of the old man who had told him that they needed help with the 30 corpses from the village that had become zombies. After thinking about it for a while, he concluded that it was something that could be handled. He then turned to the departing villagers and told them to take their belongings. They looked at him in bewilderment, not knowing what he meant. Seeing their confusion, Alan took his shovel in his hand and reminded them that they had asked him to deal with the zombies, then asked them if they were going to send him alone. Without waiting for an answer, he added with a sly smile that they could also wave something while he recited holy prayers. Hearing the prince's words and looking at his smile, the villagers unanimously concluded that before them was a real demon in the guise of a prince. Some even began to regret asking him to help. At the same time, the man who was closest to the window heard a growl coming from outside the building. It turned out to be zombies. The man immediately ran to the window and with his face reflected in horror against the glass, he began to shout loudly that the undead were already here. Although it was unexpected news, it did not cause much panic. The villagers began to rush around and arm themselves with self-defense items from the warehouse. Alan ran outside with a shovel in his hands and shouted loudly for the villagers to arm themselves with anything they could, even mops if they had to. But when he looked at what awaited him, he froze for a second. To his bewilderment, there were not 30 zombies as the old man had said, but an army of more than 100 zombies. And this army was now heading towards them with fierce roars. Angry at the old man, Alan turned to him and asked what was going on, to which he replied that it was his mistake, as he hadn't been able to count accurately when he ran away. These words made the boy angry, but there was no time for that now. They had a more serious task ahead of them. Namely to destroy an army of zombies. That's what the villagers began to do. Armed with brooms and mops, they fought back the zombies quite well. The prince did not stand idly by as another zombie attacked him with a fierce roar. He had to defend himself with a shovel. Deciding not to waste any more time and finish it quickly, Alan used the Swamp of Death skill, making his shovel glow with a bright blue light. In the next moment, a stream of holy water burst out of it, which touched the zombies, causing them huge damage. For Alan to use this skill was not very difficult, since he had been a necromancer before. When he was volunteering for a beta test of a virtual reality game to make a little extra money. But in the same game, he died of electrocution. His last memory before he passed out was the smell of burnt skin. And then he woke up in this new body. Luckily the skills from that game carried over with him, giving him a huge advantage. In addition, the holy power in his body had changed his skills, but that was a disadvantage because it was hard to control the holy power. This caused it to come out of him every time he used a skill. Wondering how to fix it, Alan was brought back to reality by someone's voice. Turning around, he saw a man sitting on the ground with a mop in his hands and desperately screaming that he couldn't take it anymore. With tears in his eyes, he said he realized they were all zombies. Turning his gaze to the woman in the pallbearer who was looking in his direction with red eyes, he added that his wife was there too. Her hand gently reached for his face, as if unwilling to part, while he wondered how he could have killed her. A single tear ran down his face. However, this was all just his fantasy, but in reality, the zombie woman lunged at him with a fierce growl. In time, however, Alan was able to disarm her before she could kill the man. "Darling," shouted the man excitedly as he saw his zombie wife fly away and fall to the ground from the prince's blow. Alan coldly told the man to stop crying and accept the fact that she was already dead. The man, shaking with anger, asked the guy what he knew. Alan pointed to his wife, who had become a zombie and no longer showed any sign of reason, and ordered the man to look at her carefully again. Then he added that her body was rotting and her soul had lost its way. Then, in a serious voice, he told the man that if he wanted his wife to stay like this and suffer, he could run away, but if he had any compassion for her, he should put aside his selfishness and start killing. While Alan was instructing the man on the right path, 3 zombies approached him and opened their mouths to rush at him with fury. Caught by surprise, the guy tried to dodge. However, something appeared in the air and caught his eye. It was someone's silhouette, which was illuminated by the sun and was approaching them at a great speed. In the next moment, the silhouette landed at a great speed and hit the ground where the zombies were, leaving no trace of them. As it turned out, it was Charlotte, who turned to Alan and asked, "Prince, are you all right?" Autumn and winter was the period of the plague, during which the whole village was plunged into darkness. Even so, Charlotte believed that it was to keep them healthy for the next year. She believed in her mother's words. However, when she returned home one day, she called out to her parents in a panic. Upon opening the door of the house, she panicked to report that there were a lot of rats outside and they were all red. However, she was never able to finish as the scene that was in front of her made her freeze on the spot with her eyes wide open. In the middle of the room on the ground sat her father, who for some reason had red eyes and dead blue skin, while in his arms lay her mother, whose neck and collar were covered in blood. At the next moment her mother, with tears in her eyes, in a weak voice turned to her and told her to run away. But she did not realize what was going on and froze at the door, trembling with fear and unable to move. The next moment the sounds of snarling zombies were heard. What Charlotte saw made her back up with a look of horror on her face. As her mom had turned into a zombie before her eyes, and they were already together with her father snarling and looking at her with rage. After this scene the girl could not remember much about what happened next. Outside the house she was chased by rats, while inside she was attacked by her parents who had turned into the living dead. She remembered grabbing the first object in her hand and waving it around. After that, all that could be heard was the snarling of zombies and the splattering of blood that streaked the walls. Sitting with her back leaning against the window behind which the zombies were roaming, with one red eye and also covered in blood marks, Charlotte pondered the fact that the people in the village had suddenly become strange. However, the zombie rats that had been trying to eat her had suddenly started ignoring her, which made her think that maybe she was turning into one of them. She didn't care now, though, because sitting alone in the middle of the room, having lost everything, she realized that no one would help her. Though perhaps if someone, even just one person, could save her. A single tear streamed down her face from her eye, which had also turned red. The next moment, however, her memories were transported to events that seemed so realistic to her, even though she found them hard to believe. A scene appeared before her in which some guy pinned her to the ground and plunged her into some puddle of glistening water, which for some reason brought her excruciating pain. However, the guy in front of her was yelling at her that she needed to hold on a little longer. Continuing to hold on despite her screams and resistance, he gritted his teeth and added that nothing else had occurred to him. The next moment her body, which had been burned by the strange water, stopped hurting and she was relieved. The next moment she woke up, opening her red eyes and staring at the ceiling with incomprehension. Breathing heavily and with her eyes wide open, she lay on her back and tried to come to her senses after such a strange dream. She wondered what those memories were, but she was torn from her thoughts by a voice that said she was finally awake. Getting up and holding her head, which was still a little sore, Charlotte asked where she was. The woman replied that she had been given a task to take care of her, and then added in a quiet voice that she should keep quiet because there were many zombies outside. Hearing the woman's words, the girl stared at her in bewilderment, trying to understand what she was talking about. Suddenly, however, her attention was drawn to the noise coming from the window. Some guy in a long coat holding a shovel was yelling at someone to stop crying and finally start killing zombies. Hearing this voice, which sounded very familiar to her, the girl froze in place as if she had seen the light she had been waiting for. The next moment she jumped off the bed and opened the window. She climbed onto the window sill, ignoring the screams of the woman who asked her what she was doing. Then with force she pushed off the window, which cracked under the girl's strength. She soared into the air, becoming the very saving silhouette the prince saw. She landed with a thunderous crash and destroyed all the zombies. Turning around and looking at him with her red eyes, she asked the prince behind her if he was okay. Turning around and looking at the prince sitting on the ground, his head covered by his own cloak, Charlotte promised herself that she would definitely save him. Looking at the scene before him, Alan could not believe his eyes. In front of him lay a huge pile of zombies that the girl had destroyed single-handedly, which caused his surprise. Looking to the side, he saw a crowd that was happily tossing the girl in the air, saying that she was their savior. Sighing, Alan concluded that the purification he'd used on her before she turned into a zombie had done something to her, but he didn't know what it was, since he wasn't particularly aware of his abilities. Deciding he would think about it later, he headed over to the rejoicing villagers, telling them to spend their time taking care of the rest of their families rather than just having fun. Adding that he knew they were tired, but it was better to get it over with quickly. The villagers nodded in agreement when they heard that. Alan added to himself that he would also help with the purification ritual. The ritual itself was quite simple. It was to bury the dead and wish them peace, so that their souls would not wander the earth, but would enjoy eternal rest. That was one of the reasons he was exiled here. It was because there was a high chance of zombies in the land of the dead spirits, so they needed someone to take care of the dead, Alan reasoned to himself as he looked up into the sky at the blue souls that were emitting a blue glow. However, even if this was the case, it still seemed unusual to him, since he had never seen a record of so many villages being in danger at the same time before. Since even now, it was still very early for the death wave. Finishing his thoughts, he turned to an old man standing nearby, who immediately turned around at his voice. Alan asked him if everything was normal in the village, and if there had been any strange or unusual events lately. He answered that nothing had happened. But he added that the plague had started about a month ago. Upon hearing this, Alan immediately gave his verdict. There was a necromancer here. This seemingly ordinary phrase for a guy gave the villagers a great deal of terror. Everywhere began to sound excited voices that it was probably the one who dispelled the plague, and that he was probably a demon who sealed the spirits. As Alan listened to all this nonsense, he looked contemptuously at the villagers and said that everything they were saying was wrong. The villagers, however, apologized to themselves at the mere mention of it, but thanks to this he was able to come to a conclusion. Namely, that if his theory was correct, the one who controlled the zombies was not far away. However, he didn't know how to find this person. Deciding that he could think about it later, he waved goodbye to the villagers and said he was going to sleep, while he told them to take care of the rest. They wished him a good night and thanked him and went on with their work. When he entered the cathedral he asked himself irritably why he was called a prince if he was there as a laborer. He approached his favorite, the best, the softest, the most beautiful. Okay, let's stop there. He tired and exhausted from the whole day he plopped down on her, after which he sighed in relief. Then he began to fall asleep, thinking that he needed to rest, as the funeral had tired him out. The next morning a loud scream woke Alan, who jumped up and tried to realize what was going on. Still sleepy, he went to the window and wondered what could have happened so early in the morning. But the next words that came from outside were not the most pleasant. Zombies have kidnapped someone. Zombies kidnapping people? Asked Alan as he left the house. One of the guys excitedly replied that he had seen it with his own eyes, while the other nodded in agreement with his friend. Then the first guy continued his story, saying that since they had been working all night, they were exhausted. The zombies took advantage of that and took Morian with them. The guy finished his story. Alan didn't pay attention to the rest of the story and asked who Morian was. He scratched the back of his head and said that she was a young lady who often gathered medicinal herbs. She was also a great help to the village, as well as a healer. Alan interrupted the boy and asked if he knew her. To which the boys looked at each other and answered that she was a beauty. And then added that she was the one who had rejected his confession. And that's why he tried to kill himself. Not wanting to hear any more of this, Alan said he remembered and asked them to stop. The next moment one of the guys loudly announced that now they should gather a search party and go after the girl. Hearing this Alan thought with annoyance about why these goons were so eager when it came to rescuing the pretty girl. On the other hand he also realized that he should check what had happened. Since this was the first time he had ever seen a zombie kidnap a human, he decided to figure out what was wrong with the situation. Putting on his cloak he casually asked if there was any way to trace the girl. One of the boys replied that Sir Hans, who was a hunter in their village, could help him. When Alan heard this, he said that they were going to get down to business, and a pleased look appeared on the boys' faces. Then he ordered them to get the hunter to help them find the girl. Alan turned around and saw Charlotte standing in front of him, staring at him from a distance. Passing by her he looked with interest at the girl who never took her eyes off him. Feeling her gaze on him even as he walked away from her, Alan wondered if she held a grudge for knocking her out. But deciding not to think about it, he shouted to the guys that they should hurry up if they didn't want the girl to become lunch for the zombies. Then they rushed after him with a confident shout. Charlotte silently continued to watch them go. Following the hunter, who said that the zombies were dragging their feet behind them and that their footprints would not be hard to find, he finally led them to the entrance of the cave and said that he was sure that what they needed was inside. He praised Hans for a job well done. Alan was pleased to note that he had managed to track them down after all. For he felt that the cave was filled with an eerie demonic energy. It wouldn't be surprising if it was full of zombies, or even the source of the plague. Although there were even places that accumulated demonic energy on their own. But in this case, judging by the zombies' actions, there was a high probability that someone was behind them. Turning to the guys who came along with him, he suddenly suggested burning the place to the ground. Hearing this, they excitedly replied that Morian was still inside. The prince pointed his finger inside the cave and said that it was quite gloomy, which made the zombies in such a place stronger. So if someone ran inside to save one girl, it would be the end of everyone. Hearing this, one of the guys holding a rake asked confusedly what they should do. He replied that the best option would be to get ready and go back, but then of course the chance of the girl's survival would be less. Suddenly behind Alan there was a growl. Not realizing what was happening, he turned around in surprise. Behind him was nothing but the huge toothy face of a zombie bear, which opened its mouth to eat him. Alan cried out in fright and bent his body to dodge the bear's attack, which had already set its teeth on him. At the same time the villagers who had come with him rushed to his aid. But it was too late, for the bear had already bitten the prince on the shoulder, causing him to moan painfully. Seeing only his feet and the villagers who ran after him, Alan was dragged along the ground by none other than the zombie bear. The very next moment he suddenly found himself in free fall, being thrown off a cliff by his delivery bear. But even in flight and with a bleeding wound on his shoulder, he managed to use the skill with his shovel, which he still held in his hand. The zombie bear was immediately hit by a stream of holy water, which, judging by his painful roar, brought him not a little pain. Alan, who had made a soft landing, immediately grabbed the wound using a skill. It was called a terrible curse, but despite the name, when he put his hand on the wound, it began to heal. Seeing the good result, he said to himself that it was just as he thought, it was a recovery spell. Even though his divine power was at its lowest point, but at times like this it was very useful to have his skills working in reverse. However, things weren't as good as they might have seemed at first glance, as the bear appeared and had already recovered. Standing on two legs and looking at Alan, it seemed even more terrifying than before. If the system window that displayed information about the creature was to be believed, it was a king of gluttony whose age was unknown, specialty was bite, cut, crash. It also indicated at the end that it was enhanced by a necromancer. After reading the last line, Alan was surprised by the information, but it explained the fact that he was standing on his feet after the holy water. Besides, it would be much harder to fight him if someone was controlling him. But all this was not as important as the problem he had in front of him, namely how to defeat the bear by brute force. The bear waited for the boy to think of something and with a fierce roar rushed at Alan, who put his shovel in front of him and tried to take the blow, but at the last moment he dodged, so that the bear's teeth grabbed only air. The bear became even more angry and lunged at the boy again, intending to strike him with his clawed paw. But he was not allowed to do so. Charlotte landed on top of him like a ray of light and plunged her knife into his red eye. It took him by surprise, and he froze in place for a second, only growling painfully. But as it turned out, he wasn't planning to die yet. And with a very loud roar he rose up on two paws. Sitting on the ground, Alan saw Charlotte and wondered why she had followed him. But he realized that he would have to think about it later, because now he had more pressing problems to solve. A huge bear that was even more ferocious than before, and which even Charlotte, despite her strength, could not hold back. The next moment she was thrown to the floor, hitting the ground with force. In the next second the bear struck her where she had been, but luckily she rolled to the side and dodged it. But that was not the end of it, as the bear immediately opened its jaws and lunged at the girl, who was still on her feet. Having no other choice, she stuck her knife right into the bear's mouth. The bear's mouth was bleeding and it began to growl, but despite the pain, it continued to press Charlotte. But the next moment a blow came from the bear's face, knocking it right into the cave wall. At the same time Alan said that she had helped him a lot, buying him time to use the skill. The girl looked at the outstretched hand and replied that she should have thanked him too. However, in place of a regular hand in front of her was a blue hand of a zombie. The girl was stunned by what she saw, and a million questions began to pop into her head. What? Isn't that Mr. Allen? Don't tell me he's turned into a zombie. It can't be, it's been too short a time. He was bitten by a zombie. What's going on? Why is his arm blue? What kind of zombie arm? This is how you fight, said Alan, whereupon zombies started to come out of the ground. Charlotte had already come to her senses and was staring at the sight in surprise and confusion. He grinned insidiously. Alan, standing in the middle of the crowd of zombies that appeared around him, he said with a smile on his face that it was impossible for the bear to win when there were so many of them. Alan's army of zombies immediately attacked the bear, biting it from all sides and preventing it from moving freely. The bear roared in pain, trying to throw off the pesky dead things that were tearing off pieces of flesh with their teeth. But even though Charlotte had gouged out his eye, the zombie bear was not going to give up and roared with a frothy roar. In the next few moments, he was able to throw several zombies off of him and throw them into the wall of the cave. As it turned out, this was not enough, as new zombies took the place of those zombies, and more dead arms began to appear from the ground, which fed to hold the bear. The bear stood up on its hind legs once more, roaring furiously with powerlessness as more and more zombie hands emerged from the ground. Alan watched the fight and realized that the bear had really nailed a lot of people, and that was the only reason he was able to summon such a large crowd of zombies. Charlotte looked at the fight confusedly and didn't know what was going on. As the pieces of the summoned zombies flew around the cave, Alan thought to himself that this bear was much stronger than his guys, but in the end it didn't matter. The enraged bear with its bloody maw made one last desperate attempt to attack. And lunged at Alan, who didn't even move and stood calmly looking at him. The next moment the bear's blood spurted onto the floor of the cave, but the bear stood still for some time. But finally he began to fall, his tongue hanging out of his bloody mouth, a knife sticking out of his head, which Charlotte had stuck there, finishing the bear's torment. Alan realized that the outcome of the fight was obvious. No matter how strong the bear was, it didn't stand a chance against so many zombies. Charlotte started to pull the knife out of the bear's head, but noticed that Alan wasn't okay and asked him how he was. Seeing that he was barely on his feet, she gave him her shoulder to lean on. Alan told her that he was fine, he was just using too much divine power. He looked around the battlefield and asked himself why Charlotte was here. Had she come to punch him for his behavior in the village or what? But there was another problem he needed to address immediately. Charlotte had seen his power and needed to make up for that nuance somehow. Charlotte took things in her own way, and when Alan started to ask her to leave him alone and not tell his secret to anyone, she thought he was saying he wanted to live peacefully in his exile, so it would be good if his power was their secret. Charlotte was in awe of the prince's nobility and self-sacrifice. At the same time, the Real Alan, with a sour face, was simply telling her to leave him alone and that he wouldn't pester her again if she kept everything a secret. Charlotte assured him that since he had saved her life, she would listen to whatever he wanted. Alan had a logical question as to how he could have saved her life. However, before he could fully ask his question, voices were heard from above, calling for the prince and Charlotte. It was the guys from the village who had brought the equipment for the descent into the cave, and now they had a lot of questions: why Charlotte had ducked down there and how the prince was still alive after the bear attack. They began to rappel down into the cave. Alan tossed to himself that they would be of absolutely no use and they should have gone home. As one of them got closer, he immediately saw a pile of dead zombies and a bear and asked them who could have done such a thing. Was it really the two of them? This bear was known as the king of gluttony and no one knew exactly how many people it had killed. Charlotte couldn't come up with an excuse, but Alan could. He hypothesized that there is or was a necromancer in this cave. And seeing the uncomprehending look on the village boy's face, he went on to explain that the necromancer had tried to set up his lair here and had killed a bear that was in his way, so when they arrived all those monsters were already dead. Such a simple lie was enough for the boys from the village, and Alan remarked to himself how simple they were. Remembering the purpose of their visit here, he thought that Maureen must be dead by now, since she was most likely just the usual bait with which the villain had tried to lure them here in hopes of killing more people with his bear. The frightened boy from the village asked him what they should do. Alan sighed in exhaustion and said they should go further into the depths of the cave. Not believing his ears, the boy asked him if he was sure. Alan answered him that he was. Although his face showed no emotion, his real goal was to see how good that necromancer was and what he had in store for them next. They all together cautiously began to go deeper and deeper into the cave, which seemed empty and lifeless. After a while they reached a small lake in the cave, into which drops were constantly falling from the stalactites above. Behind the lake they could see a passage. They cautiously approached it and peered into it. One of the guys was the first to notice the bound girl and immediately called the prince over there. It turned out to be the same Maureen. The guys from the village immediately ran to her, telling her that they had come to rescue her. However, their enthusiasm was not shared by Alan. Something was not right here. He quickly put all the facts together in his head. wondering how she could be alive. If she was the bait, why the necromancer didn't kill her and take control of her. There could only be one explanation. It was her. Meanwhile, the still-bound Morian turned to the prince. She masterfully played the innocent girl who was happy to be saved. She tearfully asked everyone if they had really come all for her. But the very next moment Alan, whom she had failed to see off, hit her over the head with a shovel. The one pretending to be Morian fell to the ground. Everyone else was shocked by his actions and didn't realize what was happening. They started hysterically asking the prince what he was doing. He paid no attention to their screams, and only carelessly told his captive that he should have hit her with the sharp side of the shovel, but he had some questions. One of the boys ran up to Morian, asking if she was okay. As the others pounced on the prince with questions about what he was doing, Alan started to explain to them that he could see everything, and an information window popped up in front of him, stating that Morgana was in front of him, who was 63 years old and specialized in black magic, dismemberment, curses, and murder. He'd said everything in his voice, she'd never been bait. However, Morgana wasn't going to give up so easily and started making excuses that they must have misunderstood something. However, her pathetic attempts to justify herself were interrupted by Alan saying that he didn't care what she said and told the others not to fall for her tricks. After all, she was the same necromancer that had terrorized their village. Everyone stammered in bewilderment. Alan continued that everything they knew about her was a lie, her name, age and all. Morgana realized in horror that he knew everything about her and now there was no getting away from her. She didn't give up her desperate attempts to justify herself. However, she screamed that it was the necromancer who had dragged her here and then tortured her. Alan teased with a chuckle, saying yes, of course. He asked her if she really thought people would trust her just because she was nice to them and started pulling something out of his pocket. He pulled out a bottle of holy water from there and offered her to drink it to confirm his words. That way they would know exactly who she was, because for a necromancer this holy water would be lethal and their internal organs would melt, but for humans it was the best medicine and then all her wounds would be healed. Morgana tried to refuse the holy water with the excuse that it was not worth wasting such a valuable thing on it. To which Alan mockingly replied that that's right, she refuses the water just because it is valuable. And then approached her about to force her to drink the vial with a gloating smirk, knowing what would happen next. Morgana had no choice, she had to either confess and then be killed immediately or drink the holy water and die in agony as well. The girl's face turned an unhealthy shade, drops of sweat appeared on her forehead and went down her face. There was only one question in her mind: how? My disguise was perfect, she thought, remembering her time in the village. For a whole year, no one had any idea who I was as long as I acted like Morian. Alan instilled more and more fear and indignation in the girl. How did that damn prince figure it out, she wondered. Remembering the prince and his companion, she asked herself. What kind of power does the prince have? How did he manage to overcome the bear? With a funny expression on his face, the prince pointed to a glass filled with holy water. He invited the girl to taste it. In a similar joking manner, he continued to lecture her. The guy explained that if a prince gives you something, you have to accept it with both hands. The girl bowed her head in surprise and agreed with him. The boy got down on one knee to give Morian the potion, when her face began to deform and her eyes lit up with fire. The left side of her face wrinkled and looked like the result of a burn. A dark aura covered the girl, giving away her bad intentions. She was going to kill the guy during the wave of death, and she told him about it. After finishing her sentence, the girl attacked the prince. The young man managed to jump away, but her energy punch hit the flask with the potion. The prince was unable to hold the potion from the impact, so it fell and shattered. Like flowers reaching for the sun, numerous skeletal arms began to emerge from the ground. Now their mistress was able to see her dead army. In a fit of anger, Morian shouted that the prince had only brought his demise closer. During her monologue, the girl, or rather the grandmother, managed to free herself from the ropes and grow old by 100 years. Before the prince appeared not a young girl, but an old witch with gray hair and a wrinkled face. The old woman continued her monologue, telling him that she wanted to let him live a little longer. She was emboldened by the skeletons that were passing by, getting closer and closer to their victim. "You will die here," the old woman kept shouting, her face twisted into an unpleasant smile. The skeletons rushed at the enemy, flames burning in their eyes and anger in their hearts. The battle had begun. The witch could not believe what was happening, she could not believe what she was seeing. The unfortunate skeleton was hit on the skull with a garden shovel so hard that you could swear tears were flowing from the places where his eyes used to be. His offender was hitting him over the head with the shovel and yelling at the top of his lungs that they were being too brazen in front of him, the prince. The prince could not calm down and ordered the skeletons to go back into the ground, good and healthy. The morale of the bones was broken. Some followed the prince's advice and began to bury themselves in the soil, some tried to protect themselves from the deadly tool, and some preferred not to join the battle and just watch from the outside. Watching the army of the dead put up a white flag and bury themselves in the ground, the old woman finally lost hope of victory. Suddenly, the old woman felt threatened, and the realization that this was the end filled her heart with despair. At that moment, a dark figure jumped out from behind her. In a split second, the girl knocked the old woman to the ground. The old woman let out a slight moan, but the girl's emotionless expression made it clear that she didn't care. Charlotte made a grab and pressed her knee to the woman's shoulders, her right hand holding the witch and her left hand a knife. The prince's voice was heard again, this time he was praising Charlotte. "What the hell," these were the words the old woman said when she saw what was happening to her warrior. The skeleton was on his knees with tears streaming down his bones, the reason for the tears was the humiliation the boy had caused him. The prince smilingly grabbed the skeleton by the skull. The witch was morally broken, she could not understand how he had defeated the skeletons, and in despair the old woman asked the prince if the shovel was the source of his power. The young man confirmed her words and added that they were making great shovels now. While he was answering, the skeleton buried itself in the ground without attracting too much attention. The witch's head was full of contradictions, she did not believe that it could be a simple shovel. The old woman turned to the boy again, asking him if it was some kind of holy relic. Keeping his hand on the shovel handle, the boy could not understand why the old woman was still concerned about this question. He advised her that she should worry about herself. After he said that, Charlotte quickly pressed the blood-covered knife to the woman's throat. After a while, the witch was already tied up and ready to share everything she knew and possessed. A swollen eye and numerous bruises on her face make it clear what made her so talkative. The old woman began to tell us that her real name is Morgana, she is a sorcerer and she is 63 years old, and she has been detained again. The men who arrived with the boy were outraged that the old woman was telling them something other than what they asked her. It was clear that the witch did not want to confess. Only after Charlotte gently reminded her of her presence did the old woman speak. Kneeling and looking at the prince, the witch mentally went through the options for escape, but with 3 men on her left side and Charlotte standing behind her with a knife ready for battle, escape was impossible. Realizing her situation, the old woman agreed to tell who ordered their murder in exchange for her life. Alan was interested in her words, he believed that she acted on her own initiative. With a disgruntled expression, the witch continued to talk. It turned out that she was supposed to seduce the prince in her young form and make his death look like a suicide. Strangely enough, the doused prince seemed to take on an even more foolish appearance than usual. Alan said to himself that Morgana was not so pitiful even since she was forced to do so. The witch couldn't understand why the boy didn't care. The secret church had ordered her to kill the 7th grandson of the Holy Emperor. And Alan did not look or behave like a man of his status. The witch began to blackmail the boy by saying that she saw through the bear that the prince was also a sorcerer. And if the church found out about it, the young man would not live long. Morgana smiled slightly. The hope that she could outwit and even manipulate the prince gave her confidence. "So you saw me?" the boy asked again. The young man's words alarmed Morgana. Then he gave an order to Charlotte, he ordered her to kill the witch. Charlotte said yes. She raised the blood-covered knife to the old woman's frightened face. The witch didn't wait for her to fulfill the order, she began to scream that she had just made a mistake, that she hadn't thought to tell anyone about him, and that she was ready to tell everything she knew about the Dark Church. A powerful slap flew into the old woman's face so that she fell to the ground. After the slap, the guy added that if she was telling everything so easily, then her words were not worth a damn. Morgana twisted and trembled with fear. The prince decided to hand the witch over to the villagers to decide what to do with her. 3 dark figures hovered over the woman, their gazes revealing the verdict of the villagers. It was not surprising, given that many had lost family members because of her. One of the men said that she should pay for her sins. Lying on the ground with traces of beatings, the old woman really looked pitiful. With a trembling voice, she began to ask for forgiveness for everything she had done. Alan, interested in what would be done to her, asked one of the men. The man's answer was specific and not pleasant for the old woman. The witch had to receive the punishment that her crimes deserved. One of the men threw Morgana over his shoulder and went off with his partner into the thicket. With a cold gaze that did not contain a drop of compassion, the man continued his dialogue with the prince. According to him, the witch was going to die a very painful death, after which her corpse would be left in the forest. Wild animals would gnaw at her flesh, and the remains would turn into zombies. Is this a worthy death for a witch who used the dead? With these words, the man ended the conversation and set off after his companions. Looking at the man's back, Alan thought to himself that this used to happen in the Middle Ages. How cruel it is. The guy looked up thoughtfully. Looking at the sunset and the flock of crows over the leafless forest, he thought about the Dark Church. Sitting in the church and reading a book, the prince remembered how he had gotten this book. Since he could not learn everything he was interested in from the witch while no one was looking, he stole the books that belonged to the old woman. He put them in his inventory. As he read more and more magic books, the boy noticed that it would be good for him as a wizard to learn to speak with spirits, but he probably would not be able to get this skill. After reading one of the paragraphs, the prince came across a reference to a wave of death and remembered that the woman had spoken of something similar. He began to recall the recent history and everything the old woman had said. Sitting with a book in his hands on the windowsill with a beautiful stained glass window and reflecting on recent events, Alan came to the conclusion that his brothers and sisters were behind the assassination attempt. Developing his thought, the boy came to the conclusion that if he was a prince, then the others probably wanted to get rid of an unnecessary competitor for the throne for their inheritance. Closing the book, the boy thought about the struggle for power. What a difficult life the members of the royal family must have, the boy said. Either because of the nap or because of the prospect of being killed, a small tear appeared in his eye. He even considered hiring a mercenary to protect him. Then he began to think about how he could improve his skills. While he was thinking, he never saw Charlotte sitting a few meters behind him on one of the benches. The girl heard some of what Alan was thinking about, because he had a habit of sometimes speaking his thoughts out loud. The girl did not want to put up with even the thought of His Majesty being beaten. Her face revealed that she was sincerely concerned about his fate. Everyone said that the prince had changed. Recalling the past, as the girl watched him from afar, Charlotte noticed that Alan had never been of a strong build, but always went into battle first. In one such incident, he saved many lives. And he held funerals for the dead. In the girl's memory, the figure of the prince appeared. She saw him from the back, in the cemetery with a shovel in his hand, looking beyond the horizon. The moonlight seemed to greet him as an old friend. And his cloak was fluttering in the playful wind. The next memory that appeared in the girl's mind was the moment when she was told that while she was lying there, His Majesty had taken care of the bodies of her parents. Charlotte's red eyes filled with tears. Even such a seemingly emotionless girl could not stand it, as she felt the possibility of losing someone important to her, albeit a ghostly one. Pulling herself together, Charlotte hit the wooden bench with her fists. Her thoughts cleared, and she decided what she was going to do next. The feeling of gratitude that Alan had saved not only her but also her parents strengthened Charlotte's resolve. Turning back and looking at the prince, she thought, she wanted to thank the guy, but it was not enough. Looking at the stack of magic books, she concluded that the prince would be in danger at every turn, so he would need a shield to protect him everywhere and always. Picking up a book with an ornate cover, Charlotte continued her reasoning. She firmly decided that if the prince was in danger, she would need to be even stronger to protect him. There were no traces of tears on Charlotte's face, she had gained a purpose that gave her strength to move on. On the first pages of the ancient magical grimoire that the boy stole, in the section on necromancy and types of the dead, it is said that the undead evolve over time. Turning the next pages reveals even more information. The next paragraph says that when the flesh of a zombie decomposes, zombies become skeletons. But if zombies manage to protect their bodies from this, they can become a stronger version of the undead, namely ghouls. A ghoul, in turn, can evolve into a creature without a head, a Dallahan, and a Dallahan has the ability to become a vampire. The higher their development, the higher their intelligence. When zombies are in the dark, the mana that was in the dark and accumulated in the darkness starts the process of their development. That is why strong mana attracts zombies. From this it follows that the place where all zombies are called, the place that attracts them, is the territory called the land of dead spirits. The trees bent under the weight of freshly fallen snow. And on the forest floor you could see dozens of footprints left by zombies' bare feet. To prevent the zombies' tissues from decomposing, they avoid warm weather, looking for dark and cold nooks and crannies. When summer ends and winter begins, a cold period sets in, just when the desire of the dead to get to the land of dead spirits reaches its peak. This time is called the Wave of Death. December 25th is the coldest day during the Wave of Death. It was on this day that the king of the land of the dead, Ammonius, died. This is the day when all the undead go to the land of the dead spirits to regain their lives. Closing the tome, the prince calculated that there were about 3 months left before the Wave of Death. Looking at the book, the boy remembered that the witch wanted to kill him just during the Wave of Death. Charlotte interrupted the prince's thoughts. With a heart full of determination, the girl approached him to offer help. She began to say that she would help the prince if he gave her. Before she could finish, the prince threw a book into her hands. "Here," he said to the girl without even listening to what she was going to say. The girl humbly took the book and took it to the shelf. Looking after her, the boy was grateful that she came every day, even though he did not ask for it. The prince began to list the tasks that the girl had taken on. Not only did she shelve the books, but she also cleaned, cooked, and looked after the cemetery. Leaning back on the windowsill, Alan decided to rest a bit. He thought about Charlotte again, and the prince assumed that she would soon get bored and stop coming to him. As far as he knew, Charlotte had been adopted by Grill. Now she had a home to return to. The prince jokingly called the man who adopted Charlotte a bastard, but he had no doubt about one thing: Grill was a good guy. There was a noise outside. It sounded like the clinking of armor. A moment later the church door opened and 3 knights in full armor entered. One could guess who they were by the blue crosses that were part of their armor. The green-eyed guy looked at the prince intently, and the prince began to assume that they had come for his soul, and he almost fell off the windowsill with excitement. Taking off his helmet, the red hair of the soldier caught his eye. After opening the information about the character, the prince learned that the guy's name was Harmon Dien. He was 33 years old, he was the deputy commander of the Knights of the Holy Cross. After that, the knight said that he had heard rumors about how Alan had caught the witch Morgana. Folding his hands in front of him in a disgruntled grimace, the prince began to analyze the situation. The knight did not greet him, which showed that he treated Alan as an outcast prince. The boy also assumed that he was being followed because the rumor of the witch had reached them so quickly. After thinking about his answer, Alan changed his expression, and the boy confirmed the rumors about the witch and added that he was not alone, but with the villagers. He also asked if there were any problems. The knight's face softened, and the man began to behave a little more freely. He continued the conversation by answering the question first. The soldiers only came to make sure the rumors were true. To finally make sure of what had happened, Harmon began to list the prince's actions. The first thing the knight asked the boy was whether he had really fought together with the villagers as a team. Alan answered that yes, at that time Charlotte joined him. The knight continued, "Rumors say that the prince and others killed the bear with garden tools." The prince did not answer this question because he did not understand something. The knight continued to inquire. He remembered the horde of zombies that had been defeated by a man named Grill, who had killed 30 zombies and cornered the witch, where he had defeated her with holy water. The prince's eye twitched with anger, and Charlotte felt ashamed of her stepfather. Harmon said that it was Grill who told him everything he knew. Alan didn't know how to react to what he heard. On the one hand, because of Grill's lies, the young man attracted less attention, but less than 5 minutes after praising the bastard, he fell back in the prince's eyes. Listening to their dialogue, Charlotte covered her face in shame. At first, the knight thought that Grill was exaggerating his merits, so Harmon checked the battlefield and made sure the man was telling the truth. At this point, the prince wanted to advise the knight not to be so good-natured and gullible. Harmon continued to ask questions. He asked if Alan knew that the witch was from the Dark Church. The boy confirmed this and added that she had told him about it herself. She spoke of the church as if it were a secret and that the prince knew about it. Haman exhaled and closed his eyes. He said that this church was a vicious organization, and that Morgana, as a member, had destroyed 5 villages. The prince opened his eyes wide when he heard the knight's words. He had been playing the fool just because he didn't know about it all. She was dangerous. Looking at the prince, the knight asked if they had gotten rid of the old woman. Alan replied that the witch had already been beaten to death and her body thrown away. Harmon again began to ask whether the prince was behind the victory over the witch, to which he replied that he did not have that much strength. Of course, it was Alan who figured it out, but he didn't want to talk about his powers. He preferred to stick to Grill's version of the villagers' help. Alan began to tell us that when he was there, he almost peed his pants with fear. Saying this, the boy almost fell down from a pretend illness, and it was good that Charlotte picked him up. Seeing this picture, Harmon almost threw up. The expression on the soldiers' faces made it clear. He and his men were unpleasantly surprised by the prince's cowardice. The knight cleared his throat and continued to ask if anyone had seen the books the witch had. Nothing was found in her lair. Their task was to find books on dark magic. The prince shifted his focus to another topic, and an imperceptible sly smile appeared on his face. He is the criminal who is currently keeping the books in his possession. To deflect suspicion, Alan suggested that the books could have been destroyed by the villagers because they radiated an evil aura. The prince suggested that the knight ask the villagers about it. Harmon agreed and thanked him. But the knight had no intention of leaving the prince alone. The last task the knight had to perform was this. Harmon took a purse of money from the hiding place. He said that there were 80 gold coins in the purse. A small reward was promised for the witch's head. Before the knight could finish speaking, the boy's hand was already on the bag of gold. The prince's face broke into a smile, and the boy thanked him and added that he was just doing his duty. Just in case, the knight mentioned that the money should be shared with the villagers who helped. The boy agreed, and the books and gold were lucky for me, the young man thought. The knight watched as the boy moved away and began to whisper something to the coins and kissed them. It was a disgusting sight. He had never seen so much greed in a person before. At the moment when the happy prince was admiring his coins, the knight said that his business here was completed and he had to leave. So he ordered the boy to pack his things. It was hard to read anything in the prince's still smiling face, and his eyes, which were wide and painful, betrayed his surprise. Charlotte was also worried, though she tried not to show it. A storm of different thoughts rushed through the prince's mind. He did not understand why he was in exile, why everything was happening again. The knight saw in his face that he was misunderstood. He exhaled to shed some light on the situation. The wave of death will soon begin, so we will accompany you. Harmon's words restored the prince's confidence. The boy assumed that he was being taken care of because he was a person of royal blood. The knight's words warmed the boy's soul. His speech indicated this, and he hoped that he would be evacuated to the royal palace or to some warm territory. But the knight clearly said no. Alan will go to Lonia's estate, which is half a day's journey from here if you ride a horse. The prince thought about it, and asked Harmon, because there was no point in moving if the estate was still on the line of the death wave. The knight answered briefly. Of course it is. Harmon's mind was filled with memories of the building. its high stone walls, watchtowers every few meters, and massive oak gates. Lonia Fortress was built for one purpose, and that purpose was to stop the tide of death. The knights gathered all the prisoners from the neighboring villages and turned them into soldiers. All in order to give a decent fight to the zombies and hold them back. The knight took a deep breath and said that there would be many victims. Alan understood. Please hold the funeral ceremony at the Lonia estate. Genid Lepin, 43, Alanian feudal lord. Merciful and sociable by nature. This is the first person the prince met when he arrived at the Lonia estate. With a sincere smile, Genid asked the prince how he was feeling after the trip. Even if the prince hadn't answered that the trip was not good, it could have been read in his face with a painful hue. The carriage was cramped and uncomfortable, as both Charlotte and Grill could confirm, as they were also somewhat wrinkled and exhausted from the journey. Lepin's attention was drawn to Grill and Charlotte. The feudal lord did not know that someone else would arrive with the prince. A man with a face full of kindness and compassion asked the newly arrived guests who they were. Grill answered in his own style. He simply said that someone good had arrived. Charlotte answered briefly that she was the prince's assistant. In his thoughts, the prince noted that although he was an outcast, the lord received him with kindness. In an imperious manner, the prince wished his companions to stop talking, and the feudal lord finally took him to a room. The feudal lord immediately began to fulfill the young man's request. In his mind, the prince was thinking about the reason for his arrival here. A huge rectangular fortification. High walls, several towers around the perimeter, and several internal barriers protected the houses of the inhabitants living within the walls. The land of the dead spirits of Lonia, also called the Sacrificial Fortress. This place was so named because many people died here, and only their sacrifice could extinguish the anger of the dead and protect the peace of the living. The castle is protected from the wave of death only by its high walls, which are strong enough to withstand the onslaught of zombies for a month. Just in time for the spring thaw and the wave of death to disappear. Dozens and hundreds of prisoners in chains walk the streets of the city under constant guard. Other prisoners are yet to arrive. All of them will be sent to the front line. They will give their lives to hold back the wave of death. Walking through the endless corridors of the castle, Alan managed to meet Harmond, with whom he struck up a conversation about the purpose of his stay. The knight confirmed that the only thing he needed from the boy was to help the wounded and conduct funerals. The young man agreed to help in any way he could. The prince's body stiffened and began to ache from the anticipation of endless work. And all because the knight told him that every year at least 2,000 people die in the wave of death. Seeing the seriousness of the situation, the prince asked if he had any helpers. The group walked along an exquisitely lined corridor with a chic chandelier. The lord walked in front, followed by the prince who continued to talk to the knight behind him, and Grill and Charlotte were the last to go. Harmon told the boy that in addition to him, the lord had 80 priests ready to perform the purification ritual. The soldiers would help with the funeral, so there was no need to worry. After a short pause, the knight added that sometimes people died of overwork, but that was normal. Hearing these words, the young man stopped. The prince addressed the lord with a single request. Almost shouting, the boy said he wanted a drink. Before the lord could even answer, the prince began to stomp his feet and cry like a child. He said that in such circumstances it is simply impossible to survive without alcohol, and he added that he would rather die from drinking than from hard work. Lord Genid Lepin fulfilled the boy's request, and in a few minutes 2 maids appeared with 2 bottles of wine. By his order, the prince instructed Charlotte and Grill to have fun. Grill was somewhat confused by this statement, but Charlotte simply agreed. Grabbing the bottles, the prince gave his last instructions to the team. They had to return to him before the wave of death to protect the prince. Grill and Charlotte answered in unison that they understood. Hearing their words, the boy turned around and entered his room. All that was left of the prince was a voice from behind the door saying that it was time for him to rest. The people present looked at the closed door for a few seconds and continued the conversation without the boy. Grill turned to the lord and said that he should trust the boy. Prince, he did not finish as the knight's words interrupted the young man's. Harmon said that the prince had grown up a lot, damn it. Standing outside the door and listening to the conversation from the corridor, the prince could not help but praise himself for his excellent acting. Of course, he wasn't going to drink. He put his hand to the bottle and muttered something, and the wine in the bottle began to fizz. A bright light appeared in the bottle, it began to affect the liquid inside, and the red wine began to brighten until it turned into holy water. Satisfied with his work, the prince looked at the bottle, he could not do without the holy water. The boy preferred to fill the bottles with holy water and drink it to keep himself alive. He continued to transfer energy into the water to learn how to control it better. While working on this, the prince noticed a gun lying on a rack. He immediately put down the bottle and walked over to the gun. Picking up a single-shot rifle and a pistol that looked like similar weapons from the 16th century, he remembered that he had read that there were firearms in this world. He was surprised because he thought that firearms were a rare privilege, but it seems to be much easier to get. In this world, firearms are almost never used, people prefer melee weapons because this world is full of different monsters. And firearms are used only for entertainment. Taking the gun in his hands, the boy noticed one difference between an ordinary gun and the gun of this world. This weapon used mana instead of gunpowder. The young man began to think about how to use it most effectively. The first thought that came to his mind was to charge the gun with holy water, but the mana consumption would be too high. As far as he knew, even experienced mages could only use the weapon 5 times before being completely exhausted. And it takes 5 minutes to create a bullet out of mana, so it's no wonder no one uses such weapons. Alan recalled that in movies, zombies were killed with a single shot to the head. The guy created a bullet, put the butt to his shoulder, and took aim. A shot and boom. A stream of blue energy burst from the muzzle of the gun. It was so strong that the shock wave from the shot created a strong gust of wind. The prince rejoiced like a little boy when he was given a new toy. Thanks to the activation of divine energy, the shot was so strong that it pierced a 20-centimeter stone wall. When the excitement and enthusiasm of the action began to pass, the prince realized that he was in trouble. Screams were already coming from the corridor. While making his rounds, Harmon heard 2 soldiers talking. The soldiers noticed that the knight was in a bad mood and discussed the reasons for their commander's bad mood, perhaps because of the wave of death, or perhaps because of the 7th prince, they could not agree. The knight turned to the soldiers and gently advised them to watch the prisoners better. The frightened men immediately agreed. Analyzing what had happened, the knight came to the conclusion that they were right about something, this prince. Yesterday, Harmon heard a loud noise. When he found its source, that is, the prince's room. The prince was half leaning out of the door, saying that it was not necessary to look into his room, that he was a very sensitive teenager, and that the knight was trying to enter his personal space. Continuing his rounds, Harmon said out loud that the prince was an idiot and the knight was sure that the boy had broken something. Harmon never noticed the hole in the outer wall of the manor. The knight recalled how he collected information about the boy from the villagers. The old man and several other villagers said that after the suicide attempt, the prince changed a lot, as if he had lost his memory. He did everything necessary at the cemetery and even fought a zombie. He saved us. That's what they said. Harmon couldn't believe what they were saying. It was complete nonsense. The prince must have been blackmailing them. A picture appeared in the knight's mind of the prince beating an old man to make him do what he wanted. The knight could not understand how such a fool managed to defeat such a powerful witch as Morgana. The image of Grill appeared in the knight's mind, muscular, purposeful, he must be very strong, thought Harmon. For the knight, everything only gets more confusing, no matter how much he thinks about it. In the end, the knight decided to write a letter of recommendation for permission to take the knighthood exam. Harmon continued his patrol. A noise at an intersection caught the man's attention. He hurried to the source of the noise, probably the prisoners were rioting again, he thought. Running around the corner, the knight shouted at the perpetrators. "What are you doing? We are about to have a hard battle." But when he saw what was happening, he stopped in disbelief. The beaten young man was lying on the ground, the prince's foot was pressing on his chest, and the best weapon the world had ever invented, a garden shovel, was hovering over his throat. Alan's face radiated anger and aggression, his eyes intently staring at the unfortunate man lying at his feet. Hovering over his opponent, the prince asked, "Don't you know who I am?" The day after arriving at Lonia's mansion. While digging another hole with a shovel, the protagonist cursed in a tired voice. His work was due to the fact that people were beginning to die en masse from disease and overwork. As he continued digging, he thought that it was no wonder they cared about him so much, because they obviously just wanted to make him work. There was a mask around his neck that looked like a plague doctor's mask. It wasn't the most common one, as it had a cleansing spell on it to prevent infection. Stopping and wiping the sweat from his forehead with his hand, he wondered if time was running out as the zombies would be coming soon. However, his thoughts were interrupted by a voice that called out to him. He immediately turned around and looked at the speaker. It was Hayes Hedron, who was the eldest son of Count Hedron. Surrounded by his cronies, he smirked slyly and asked if he wanted to take a break. The boy assumed that the prince was a student of the academy, as the simple expression on his face indicated. The prince asked, "What kind of academy?" Hayes was surprised. He thought that Alan had been sent here because of some disciplinary offense. Behind their backs, Hayes' friends began to mock the prince. Children from noble families could easily get an education, and the boys assumed that Alan was just some village ignoramus. To which the boy replied in his own style, making a face, the prince awarded them the title of idiots. One of Hayes's friends continued to pour on that in order to live together and not have any problems, they should obey Sir Hayes. Another sycophant continued to praise Hedron, adding that he was the eldest son of the Lord. Hayes interrupted the conversation, saying in a pompous manner that he was only here because he was looking for a new servant. Pointing his finger at a group of people digging graves, including a white-haired girl, the young man said that the girl was exactly what he needed. Hayes wanted to know if Charlotte was really Alan's maid. With a smile, Hayes revealed to the young man that he had had his eye on the bitch for a long time, and she was not bad. Continuing his tirade, Hayes said that he had already told her once that he would take care of her, but she ran away in fear, and then forced the boy to raise his hands. Alan heard these words and said in a half-hearted voice that Hayes was a son of a bitch. The prince decided to dig graves rather than stay in the company of these fools. Taking a shovel, he started to work. Hayes looked at the boy and asked if he was leaving. Receiving no answer, Hayes called for the servants. Charlotte asked if the young man was talking to her. The boy confirmed it and asked the girl to come closer. As soon as the girl got close enough, he caught her by the arm and pulled her toward him. The girl was surprised, and because of Hayes, she spilled all the food she was carrying on the tray. The young man suggested that Charlotte have fun with them instead of the owner. The girl refused, saying that she still had a lot of work to do. With an evil smile, Hayes continued to hold her hand, which he did not think of letting go. Looking into the girl's sincere face, the guy continued the conversation. He began by saying that Charlotte did not understand anything, no one was going to have fun with commoners like her. In a split second, Charlotte freed her hand and grabbed Hayes' wrist so hard that he screamed in pain. The prince who was watching was surprised by the girl's strength, she could have broken his arm. Hayes finally broke free from the girl's grasp, holding his reddened wrist, he began to yell at the girl and call her a bitch. He also asked Charlotte if a bitch like her had nothing to show but strength. He was interrupted by the prince who came to the girl's aid and ordered him to stop. But Hayes could not be stopped, he continued to insult the girl. The guy remembered her parents and said that she could see that her parents were creatures, and the girl looked like them. Knowing that half of the dead become zombies. Your father and mother will be. The boy was interrupted by a swing of a shovel that almost cut off his arm. The prince lost his patience. Hayes shivered and asked the prince what he had just done. The prince replied in his usual manner that he had made a mistake while digging the grave. When asked what the mistake was, the prince punched Hayes in the face. At the same time, the prince mocked saying that his hand slipped. Hayes flew about a meter in front. His henchmen immediately screamed. But no one listened to them. As soon as Alan put his foot on Hayes, the guy shouted if the prince didn't know who he was. The prince asked him in return if Hayes knew who he was. Putting the shovel to the boy's throat, Alan asked him again if he knew who he was. The fight was stopped by Harmond, who put his arm around the prince and pushed him away. The knight asked if the prince was going to do something again. The situation came to a head. Charlotte screamed that Hayes had hit her, and the boy, in turn, denied everything with tears and began to shout his name. The knight said that he could not let it go and took the prince's hand. Putting his finger to his mouth, Alan whispered, "Silence." The energy began to burst out of the prince's body and in the form of chains bound everyone present with a powerful spell. The knight wanted to say something but could not. In his mind, he guessed that it was a spell that used holy power. The prince turned to the knight with a stern look and ordered him to present him to these scoundrels. Unable to refuse the order, Harmond said the prince's full name. Alan Elphos VII, Prince and grandson of the Holy Emperor. These words sounded like a bolt from the blue to Hayes's company. Hayes was the next person the prince addressed. The prince wanted to know if he understood whose servant he had treated so rudely, and to whom he had not shown the necessary respect. Sitting on his knees, with his arm injured and trembling with fear, Hayes looked pitiful. "You don't have to be afraid," the prince said in a different tone. He looked completely different now, the ominous look had disappeared and a smile appeared on his face. With his hands at his sides, Alan said that if Hayes sincerely apologized, there would be no problem. With the same smile, Alan looked at Charlotte from behind bars. Caught by the metal bars of his cell, the prince asked the girl what kind of problem they had. The girl told him that according to the words of the Holy Knight, the injury inflicted on the son of a nobleman cannot be forgiven. Hayes lost consciousness and had to be carried out of the courtyard on a stretcher. Charlotte began to apologize, because it was because of her that the prince was imprisoned for a whole week. The prince told her not to worry about him, he wouldn't even notice how the week had flown by while reading books, and it was all the bastard's fault. The boy was also a little bothered that he was the grandson of the emperor and still in prison. Looking through the barred window, he saw snowfall. A blizzard was raging outside. One of the soldiers ran to Harmond to report. The prisoners had been instructed to shovel the snow, but the blizzard was so bad that they were not able to do it. But the knight's thoughts were far away, his head was full of the spell the prince had cast. He wondered if the seventh prince knew that he had used the spell. The knight still thought the boy was incapable of anything, but he was still the grandson of a holy emperor. The knight was brought out of his stupor only by the scream of his subordinate. Pulling himself together, Harmond ordered to continue clearing the snow to maintain the height of the walls. Leaning against the wall, Harmond continued his thoughts. It was freezing and there were not as many zombies as usual. The Holy Emperor killed the King of the Dead Spirits on December 25th. A soldier who was nearby asked the knight if he could report this to the family of the Holy Emperor. Without answering the question, the knight only said that it was a good sign. He also added that it was necessary to return the prisoners back behind the wall. One of the soldiers began to ring a massive bell, telling everyone that it was time to return. The huge gates opened and let the tired prisoners inside. In the blizzard, no one noticed the bloody footprints in the snow and the limbs scattered everywhere. There was a loud and commanding voice against the wall, shouting for the gate to be closed quickly. The two boys who had escaped at the last moment were on their knees, breathing heavily. The guards came up to them and immediately told to call the priests to help them. They said, breathing heavily, that the zombies had attacked them from behind and they couldn't find them because of the blizzard that had taken them by surprise. Then with horror and tears, one of the guys reported that everyone who was behind them had already been eaten. This information set everyone in motion and shouts were heard all over the city, as well as commands to get into position, climb the walls, and prepare for battle. Harmond stood on the wall and looked down and asked himself why it was so quiet. After all, the day of death of the King of Dead Spirits Amon was coming soon. And at this time zombies just could not help but appear, and soon there should be at least 3,000 dead people. At the same time, the people armed themselves and began to climb the wall in preparation for defense. While the priests dressed in the mask of plague doctors and treated the wounded. But Harmond wondered how it could have happened, because no one would have thought that the zombies would attack from behind. Turning around he frowned at the thought of those who had suppressed their instincts by hiding under the snowdrifts. But it was hard to believe, since the undead were just dead people who were not afraid of anything and relied only on their instincts. Since the undead didn't wear equipment and didn't use any strategies, they could easily deal with them every year. This time, however, things were completely different. After all, the zombies were no longer just a group, each member acting on their own. This time they were facing an impeccably prepared army that included both drummers and infantry with tanks, which, as if following someone's instructions, held the line. Standing in bewilderment and shock, Harmon wondered how this could have happened. But the next moment his thoughts were interrupted by someone's voice, which penetrated to the depths of his soul and made the guy in a daze frozen in place. The voice addressed to all the men and told them to be afraid and wait for their death. Hearing it, the soldiers looked at their commander with incomprehension, not understanding what was going on. Ahead of the army appeared a procession that consisted of several zombies dragging on their shoulders a throne, on which sat the owner of the voice, who added that the fear of the people would be based. For he was the judge of this world, the Messiah who would save the world through death. A follower of the god of death, Udai. As it turned out, the speaker was a huge and ugly vampire who only had fangs and red eyes and clothes, but otherwise looked more like a pig who smiled evilly on his throne. There was a white aura coming from him, while behind him was a red magic circle with many different skulls in the center. According to the system window that was above his head, he was a vampire count with mana-solving bite abilities and necromancy, and his personal characteristics were that he was very arrogant. At the same time Alan closed the book and noted that it was very noisy outside. He hid it under the bed and wondered what could have happened there, for the food was also delayed. Getting out of bed and going to the window he said irritably, "How dare they make the prince starve?" The next moment, however, a loud voice called out to him. Taking it as a fear that he might escape, he replied that he had no intention of doing so. However, Janard Lappin, who was the owner of the voice, told him to come out. To which the principal, approaching the entrance, replied that he was still in custody. The feudal lord, fumbling for the right key with his hands trembling with excitement, replied excitedly that it was not the most important thing at the moment, as there was a whole squad of dead men outside. On hearing this he asked if there were not enough workers, thinking that there were so many corpses that there were not enough laborers to bathe the graves. To which the man replied that it was not that at all. A concerned voice added that there was indeed a whole horde of zombies brought in by a vampire. These words shocked the protagonist. Not really trusting the feudal lord's words, he interrogated "Your did not seem, because what here could forget such a high-level monster?" To that he opens the door of the camera replied that he spoke their language and also controlled other monsters, which meant that it was definitely a vampire. He opened the door and allowed Alan to come out. He said in a worried voice that he didn't know what had happened, but it didn't matter as only the holy knight Harmon was fighting them off. Although he was a brave knight, he was not enough and the fortress could be hit at any moment. He then added that because of this, he as a prince needed to evacuate to a safer place. Adding that he would escort him personally. Once again hearing a noise and loud stomping, Alan asked the feudal lord what it was. He replied that it was probably a squad of zombies, adding in a hurry that they had to leave through the back door. However, as it turned out, it was too late to leave. In the next moment, a large ball of zombies flew straight to the cell where the prince was. After hitting the wall, he immediately with a rumble broke through it, which greatly frightened the protagonist. Abruptly turning around, and in confusion and bewilderment looking at the broken wall, as well as a pile of zombies that lay on the floor, he wondered what it was. But he had no time to wonder what was going on, as the zombies lying on the ground began to rise, and glaring with their red eyes began to approach him. The feudal lord and the protagonist were amazed that the vampire could think of rushing directly into the chamber where the prince was a crowd of zombies. Then there were cries that the zombies had invaded the fortress. Clenching his shovel tighter, Alan gritted his teeth and wondered what was going on outside, if even here the zombies could get to them. Realizing that they could not delay any longer, he closed the doors of the chamber, preventing the zombies from getting through. He shouted in a firm voice to the feudal lord to come to his senses and go to command the soldiers, adding that the more people killed, the more zombies would become. When Lord heard his words, he headed for the exit and said he would do so. Alan gritted his teeth and held the door, thinking about what he should do. The prince had won all the battles before only because the monsters were of a low level, and now there were too many of them. The zombies were leaning against the bars with all their weight trying to break through. In this situation, the only thing left for the prince was to use magic. Putting his hand forward, he cast a spell. A glow filled the prison cell, and the zombies on whom the rays fell instantly burst into blue fire. In a few minutes, the job was done. Opening the cell door and arming himself with a shovel, the prince decided to go outside as soon as possible. After passing the dead bodies charred by the magic, Alan climbed out through the opening into the courtyard. The blizzard was still quite strong, but the young man was still able to see what was going on. What he saw did not give him hope for victory. Everywhere were the screams of soldiers who were not ready for such a different situation, their cries could be heard from afar. Some had already fallen, being torn to pieces by the dead, others were on the verge of death trying to tear the zombie away from their flesh, while the luckiest fought off the corpses with long spears. People were being torn alive. A group of warriors with spears and shields were protecting the retreating people, but a scream dashed their hopes. Zombies were everywhere, being thrown behind the wall. The zombies quickly spread across the area sowing death. This allowed them to attack from the rear on unprotected soldiers. Nowhere was safe, the courtyard was teeming with living corpses. Seeing the deaths of the brave soldiers who tried to hold the line of defense, the boy grit his teeth. The prince did not know how long he would last, but thanks to the supply of holy water he had prepared, he still had an ace up his sleeve. He could not sit back and watch. He had to act. Raising the shovel above him, Alan filled it with magic and slammed it into the ground. He had a feeling that the goddess Gaia was angry with him because he was not able to control it. He drove the shovel into the ground and began to spread the blessing. Like a wave, the holy water appeared and began to swirl around the boy, rising upwards. The prince was soaked to the skin, but it could not stop him, the spell was ready. A debilitating epidemic. After the spell was activated, an anomaly began throughout the castle. Instead of snowfall, it began to rain. It was not just ordinary rain, but holy water poured from the sky. One by one, zombies filled the streets of the city with screams. From the contact with the drops, their bodies began to burn, causing them terrible suffering. The knights noticed that the advantage was on their side, their enemies were melting before their eyes. Another advantage of the spell was that the wounds of both ordinary citizens and soldiers began to heal. People quickly realized that holy water was pouring from the sky and thanked the goddess Gaia. One of the villagers pointed to the prince, and everyone realized who had created this magic. The holy water swirled around the prince in waves, creating water streams, so no one had any doubts. Everyone was surprised that the prince was able to use holy water. He was an outcast. Yet he is the grandson of the hero who stopped the king of the dead spirits, Ammonius, 50 years ago. The grandson of the holy emperor Elphos. At that moment, one of the soldiers ran out and said that the lord of the castle had opened the basement and was ready to shelter everyone in need. A woman with a baby was the first to respond to the call, and the rest of the townspeople followed suit. Moving to the shelter, everyone thanked the prince for the chance to survive. The prince accepted the praise, but unfortunately his strength was almost gone. Making it rain holy water in the entire castle was quite a difficult task even for him. Already half unconscious, the boy praised the surviving soldiers and ordered them to go with him to help Knight Harmond. The men apologized and said that their weapons were ineffective against the zombies. Alan told the soldiers that the undead could not be defeated by conventional weapons. So he gave them a blessing. Magic shone around the soldiers' spears. The prince said that he was enchanting the weapon for the first time, so he did not know how long it would last. The soldiers now had a holy buff on their weapons. The soldier asked what kind of magic it was. The prince explained that now their weapons are not as weak as before. And that after all they had to pay for Alan saving their lives. The prince led the boys to the gate. For life we must fight, that's what he said before the gate opened. Even through the blizzard, it was clear that the snow was reddened with shed blood. The soldiers were valiantly defending the main entrance from the invader, although they lost many men. When the soldiers who came with the prince came out, they immediately rushed to help their comrades. They were very surprised that with just one blow they could put the dead to rest forever. They really believed that the weapon had received holy power, and with a high fighting spirit, the boys rushed to help the knight. Their mood was transmitted to the others, and they all believed that they had a chance because they had a descendant of the hero with them. Everything changed when the Dalahan appeared on the battlefield. Dressed in armor and armed with a magic spear, he was a force to be reckoned with. Fire burned in place of his head, and the same fire burned instead of his horse's mane. On his bone horse, he cut 2 people and several zombies in half with a single movement. One of the surviving soldiers froze when he saw a spear at his throat. He shouted that they could never defeat such a monster. But he was not alone. A gun muzzle appeared on his shoulder. The prince apologized for using the boy as a gun stand. This shot was to be the second in Alan's life, so the prince had to get so close and have some support. There was not a drop of fatigue on the prince's face, only the smile of a child who can use his favorite toy. Dalahan did not sit idly by, bringing his spear. He prepared to attack, but it was too late. The bullet of holy water was faster. Sitting on his throne, the Lord could feel the energy of life still glowing in the soldiers who were trying to hold the line. Not only the energy of life but also the smell of meat, which the Lord had not eaten in 50 years, captured his attention. His thoughts were only about the juiciness of the bodies and the possibility of raising them as dead to strengthen his army. The Lord had been waiting for this for 50 long years. He had come a long way, from a stupid zombie living only by instincts to a ghoul, from a ghoul to a Dalahan, and so on until he became a vampire lord. What a long way he had come, the Count repeated to himself. Vampires are divided in status by mana levels. Since the Count became a vampire not so long ago, others have not yet recognized him as an equal, but he believes in his powers and will do anything for recognition. And an artifact of unprecedented power will help him realize his plan. The skull of King Ammonius. The king's head looked like an ordinary goat's skull with 4 horns instead of 2, but what was surprising was the eyes, which seemed to have not died and continued to perform their functions. Thanks to this skull, the Count can collect a large amount of mana in a couple of decades, which would normally take centuries. Also, one of the skull's abilities is to control 20,000 dead. With such an army of the dead, the Count will conquer everything without getting up from his throne. The Count's ambitions make him dream that one day he will be able to become a king. Moreover, he is no longer a mere undead, now he will not be affected by some holy water. The Count wished the knights to surrender and become model dead men. The battle was still going on at the city walls. Harmond ordered not to stop firing with ballistae, to make every effort to kill as many dead as possible, and everything had to be done before sunset, because at night the zombies become stronger. The knight reminded them that the soldiers were responsible for the lives of the townspeople, and if the dead got inside, it would be the end of them all. The knight was in doubt. He couldn't transfer command and check the village because the enemy army was too close. But his concern for the townspeople kept him focused. Clutching his sword, he fell further into despair, wishing that the Holy Emperor was here. He was brought out of his stupor by Charlotte's phrase that the village was safe because the prince was here. The girl brought spears and swords to the soldiers. There was no fear or doubt on her face. Only confidence. She continued her speech, saying that if the prince was here, she would defend this place with all her might. Charlotte threw her weapon on the ground. She heard that the knight ordered to bring the weapon to the wall, so she helped. Harmond was amazed at her strength. He thought she was just a maid, but when he saw how many weapons the girl brought, he doubted it. Even seasoned warriors are not able to carry so many weapons now, so he wondered where such strength came from. Seeing that the girl was ready to rush into battle without fear, Harmond praised her, saying that even a child like her was doing her best. He added that he was no slouch either. The girl gave him courage, and his thoughts calmed down. The knight again believed that they would win and made a new plan of action in his head. In the worst case he would have to fight through the horde of zombies and cut off the vampire's head. But it was not easy. The dead giants launched a zombie projectile right into their position. Seeing that a whole bunch of dead people were flying at them, the knight hesitated a bit and quickly came to his senses. he ordered the girl to move away and stand behind him because it was very dangerous here. And he took a fighting stance and drew his sword. He asked Time, the god of war, to give him strength. The knight's sword began to accumulate energy in preparation for the attack. Before he could finish the spell, Charlotte jumped in front of the cannonball of zombies and cut them in half with a single blow. The stumps of the core fell to the left and right of the knight. The girl landed near the wall. The knight kept looking back at the corpses of the zombies, wondering how this fragile girl had done it. The zombies she had defeated were not even able to move. There are two ways to stop a zombie: destroy its head or strike it with a weapon with holy water. Looking at how the girl cut the zombies to pieces, the knight wondered what an interesting sword Charlotte was wielding. Each blow of the girl was deadly. She cut off heads in one swing, neither meat nor bones could stop the sword blades. The knight noticed that the girl's fighting tactics were not accurate. She compensates for her lack of sword skills with brute force. Continuing his observations, Harmon began to recognize her strokes. Her style was very similar to the art of imperial swordplay, which was passed down to the Order of the Holy Cross. From a high wall, Harmon tried to shout to Charlotte, and as soon as she noticed him, he asked where she had learned it and if she was a member of the imperial family. The girl replied that she was just the prince's maid and that she had learned this technique from a book, but unfortunately, due to a gust of wind, the guy didn't hear anything and the girl turned around and went on to destroy the enemies. One of the soldiers threw a box filled with bottles of holy water and ordered the priests to heal the wounded with it. Lord Gerald Lepin, who was helping the priests, asked where the holy water came from, and the soldier replied that the prince had given it to him. The prince said he had taken a few bottles from home just in case. The Lord exhaled and praised the prince for his foresight. He also asked where the prince was now. The soldier reported that Alan had taken the survivors from the courtyard and sent them to the main gate, while he went to help those on the wall. Seeing the concern on the count's face, the soldier added that he thought Alan had gotten permission to do so. The count replied that the problem was not that everyone praised the prince and his holy power so much, or that the Lord did not trust him or doubted him. The count was concerned about the safety of the prince. No one could know for sure whether the castle would survive today. There were traces of blood and remnants of weapons everywhere on the streets. If you looked closely, you could make out the traces of bloody boots. They were left by a detachment of special zombie soldiers. Arriving at one of the walls, the prince put on a priest's mask that looked like a mask worn by plague doctors from the real world. Alan did not introduce himself, just said that he was helping. The soldiers of the wall were surprised that someone came to them because they thought that the main gate had almost fallen. So they sent half of their soldiers to reinforce the gate. The boy had used up all the holy water for one of his abilities, so he had nothing left. The skill he used is called Ghost Soldiers. He raised the dead soldiers of the estate and used their bodies as his personal guard. In order not to be discovered as someone who uses necromancy, the prince ordered the dead to cover their faces with masks, and he did not announce who he was. The soldier who was nearby was worried about the guy. The priest was better off in the rear, but the prince said that he had a task here and pointed to his rifle. He was going to use it, but the soldier objected, saying that this weapon was useless here. But the prince didn't care. He approached the edge of the wall to one of the shelters and took aim at the vampire lord. The wall offered an incredible landscape. Hordes of zombies were marching forward trying to take the city gates in numbers, while behind them giants were loading their catapults with the dead and firing. In the center of this was the vampire count sitting on his massive throne, watching the progress of his army. Taking the count in his sights, Alan filled the cannon with his energy and with the words that it was time for the count to taste the grace of Gaia fired. One of the holy knights ran up to Harmon and reported that the evacuation was over. What he heard allowed the knight to finally enter the battle without looking back. Harmon was about to rush forward but was stopped by a soldier. He told him that everything was not as bad as it might seem. The warriors at the gate had weapons charged with holy water, and some soldiers were as good as the holy knights in their skills. Images of Charlotte and the prince's corps of dead appeared in the boy's mind. Harmon wondered what was going on while he was defending the walls. But he was glad the situation hadn't gotten worse. But the main problem hadn't gone away, the vampire count was still alive. As he beheaded another zombie, Harmond asked what success they had had with remote attacks. The knight said that they had tried everything, ballistae, arrows, and stones, but to no avail. When a projectile approaches the count, a protective blood barrier is activated to block attacks. Harmond reasoned that even a weapon charged with holy water would not be able to penetrate the shield. And he will still have to fight his way through the army of the dead to take the vampire's head off. But now they are not able to repel the attack of the dead, let alone attack themselves. One of the knights noticed a glow spreading somewhere on the wall. The first thought was that it was a priest, but how could an ordinary priest have such power? The power used by the priest was painfully familiar. A bluish glow filled the area around the prince, and from the center of this glow came an incantation to Gaia, the goddess of love and mercy. A request was made for holy salvation and the power to strike the dead. Behind the prince's back, a giant-sized woman appeared translucent. To pierce the vampire's shield, Alan called upon the goddess herself to help him. The knight's face lit up as soon as he saw the deity, the particles of light formed a divine image. The goddess seemed to hug the boy, giving him her power. The magic used by the prince was rare even for experienced priests. While the soldiers and knights were wondering and trying to find out who had used such magic, Charlotte immediately said that it was the prince and she could see his shine. Harmond disagreed with her. The prince who had opposed the goddess Gaia had received her blessing. How could this be, he thought. If it is really him, it turns out he takes over the love of the goddess. Gaia was almost twice as big as the walls of the city, her majesty and beauty left no one indifferent, although her face was not visible. And then the moment came, the weapon was fully charged. With Alan's words that it was time to taste the goddess's blessing, the guy took aim at the count's groin and advised the count to save his balls from the goddess's powers. The shot was of incredible power and even the numerous bodies of zombies it tore apart did not diminish its strength. The barrier worked as usual, but this time it could not protect the owner, it flew into pieces and hit its target. It is impossible to express the emotions and feelings that the count felt. Only his scream could be heard in the glow of the explosion. A bit of information about the methods of gathering holy power, all of which are written in the Book of the Holy Emperor. It is interesting that a magician uses spells and mana, while priests use prayer and holy water. Necromancers use life and magical power. If the prince wanted to use the latter, he would have to say goodbye to his life and magical energy, but is the game worth the candle? The prince has plenty of holy water thanks to his background as the grandson of an emperor. If he could learn to use the powers without sacrificing his life, he could give the role of priest another chance. That's what Alan was thinking while sitting on the windowsill in the church. He decided to see what would come of his plan. A terrifying scream burst from the count's throat. The blow was so powerful that the throne was thrown back with its owner on a stretcher. The count began to call for reinforcements to defend himself and prepared to retreat. Seeing this, the prince regretted that the shot could not kill the vampire, but at least his retreat would give him some time to gather and prepare. Alan had invested a lot of energy in this shot, so he intended to rest. But when he saw numerous soldiers standing around discussing his strength and the fact that he was an experienced priest, Alan decided to run away to avoid attracting even more attention, saying that the wounded needed to be healed and that he had to take his dead and run away from the soldiers. The soldiers still praised the boy, saying that with such a strong priest the wounded would be healed in no time. Harmond was still not sure whether a boy who deserved to be exiled could perform such a miracle. And how Charlotte with such skills could become the prince's servant. The knight went over in his head everything the villagers told him about the prince. But he did not believe what he heard. Had the prince really changed after losing his memory? Could he have forgotten what had happened in the past and become the same as he had been before that incident? The knight's memories reached the day when Her Majesty Lucia died. The mother of the first and seventh Prince Lucius. She was a simple country girl who mixed the blood of two races, the Holy Nation and the Southern Aslan. Races that had fought a fierce struggle for centuries. Because of her background, many people close to the crown did not accept her. But this did not stop the son of the Holy Emperor from loving her and marrying her, and after a while they had their first son. But unfortunately, the Holy Imperial family had too much influence on the state, so 2 ladies of noble blood were attached to the son of the Holy Emperor. After that, several more children appeared, and Lucia gave birth to the 7th prince, Alan. She and the prince were very close, but unfortunately when the prince was 10 years old she died, killed by a vampire who attacked her while she was out walking with her sons. The eldest son tried in vain to protect his mother, she was torn to pieces, and the first prince only miraculously survived that day. But after that he began to suffer from a heart curse. After this event, the 7th prince turned from a kind-hearted boy into a heartless and emotionless one, and it was said that the event shocked him so much that he went crazy. The knight continued to wonder whether a person who lost his memory after a failed suicide could become the same as he was before. But memory has nothing to do with holy power, so why did the prince hide his abilities? Perhaps he did not want to publicize his power so that the imperial family would not know anything. Maybe he was planning to take revenge on them. Harmond understood the boy well. The imperial palace was not a good place, especially for princes and princesses. It was not easy for them. Higher-ups and nobles were always happy to say a sharp word in their direction. Maybe the 7th prince wants to take revenge on the nobility and the vampire for his mother's death. What if he planned his exile only to become stronger, away from the constant surveillance of the palace inhabitants? The Holy Knights have direct contact with the royal family, so Harmond understood the reasons why the prince was somewhat cold to him. And Charlotte could be from a good family. The knight remembered Lucia, who had always been kind and sweet. Charlotte was a bit like her. Harmond plunged into his memories. The first prince ordered to bring help. The knight had left them alone, and he still regretted it. No matter how hard he tried, Harmond could not forget the shame of that day when he failed to protect the royal family. The knight became more and more convinced that the prince was preparing revenge. That is why he endures the humiliation and cruelty of others without resisting. Looking at the night fortress, Harmond decided to help Alan in everything he planned, even in his revenge. It's the only thing he can do to make amends. But first he has to deal with the defense of Lonia. While walking along the wall, the knight met a soldier who seemed to be on patrol, but there was one strange thing about him: he was without a lantern at night. Looking closely, the knight saw ragged steps and a crooked posture. Harmond realized that he was not a man. Drawing his sword, the knight rushed forward trying to cut the enemy in half. But the zombie blocked his attack, which surprised him. To protect his comrade, another zombie fired 3 arrows that hit the ground in front of the knight, preventing him from advancing. Harmond realized that the zombie was not alone. He was also confused by the energy radiating from the zombie, which was very similar to holy power. But without leaving any room for doubt, the knight pushed the enemy away with all his might and brought his sword over his head, preparing for the decisive blow. A voice came from the darkness and ordered him to stand. The zombie, who was kneeling at the time, froze after the knight's blow. Harmond was surprised by this and asked the one who came out of the shadows what was going on. Alan came out of the shadows of the tower and ordered the knight to lower his sword. After a while, walking along the walls, Alan and Harmond continued their conversation. The prince asked whether the knight had finished rearranging the army because the dead would soon return. The prince said that after midnight the day of King Amon's death would come and he wondered if the zombies would become stronger at that time. Harmond then asked His Majesty if he really used necromancy. The prince replied that he didn't know, and at that moment the thought that he had failed tormented the boy. The knight began to panic. This was not something that could be talked about so safely. The knight asked about the prince's despair, whether it was so great that he turned to necromancy. The prince repeated that he really did not know. But he added that, as the knight had already realized, the prince had managed to summon the undead. But due to memory loss, the guy does not remember how he got these skills. He did it only to help in the battle. The knight looked intently into the boy's eyes. Alan realized that the knight would not believe him even if he told him that he had changed. The knight began to question him again, asking if Alan had made a deal with the devil, how his zombie had such a holy power. The prince again began to deny that he knew nothing and that he had always been fond of necromancy. The guy asked about his fate. Would the knight tell the inquisitors about him? That was his question. Harmon said that of course he would. Thoughts flashed through the prince's mind that he was lost, that he would be caught and tortured. He had only hope in Charlotte. Salvation could only come from her. But the knight interrupted his thoughts. Harmon got down on one knee and looked at the boy intently. After a second, the knight said that he would not do it, he was willing to help the prince to the very end. Looking at the knight, Alan was stunned. He had always thought that Harmon hated him, but it turned out that it was quite the opposite. The knight was ready to help the prince, and it was clear from his face that everything he said was not a joke. Everything started to spin in the prince's mind. Alan believed that the knight decided it was time to pull the right strings, although the prince believed that the thread the knight chose was rotten. Not believing in Harmon's pure intentions, the prince responded to the knight's call in his humorous way. Turning to the knight, the prince assumed that the boy was not really going to help him, it was just a good opportunity to follow the prince without attracting attention. The knight apologized. Rising from his knees and leaning on the wall ledge, the knight continued to pour out his heart to the boy. He lowered his eyes and denied the prince's allegations. When the prince was still a child, the knight began to speak when Alan interrupted him. The prince's attention was drawn to something in the sky. The prince spoke to the knight, asking him not to forget what he had to say, but now they had to do what their duty required. Alan had been watching the moon in its fullness, which had turned red. Looking at the knight, the prince said that the time had come, the enemy would not wait, because right now the enemy is most saturated with mana and he would not waste time. No sooner had a drop of sweat fallen from the boy's face than the army appeared to confirm his words. "Merry Christmas, Harmon," the young man said. Under the rays of the red moon, the army of the dead launched its final offensive. Thousands of zombies and hundreds of headless horsemen rushed to the city walls. Looking at all this, the prince added to his first greeting a Halloween greeting. Christmas, Halloween. These words, and their meanings were incomprehensible to the knight. In the rear of his army, the vampire count began his motivating speech. He urged the dead to eat the living and reproduce in this way, because the time of the dead had come. The count also promised that the undead who served him would become kings like him. Having accumulated energy in his mouth, the count released a purple beam that cut through everything that got in the way, causing great destruction. The dark beam missed its target and the army that left the city and prepared for battle was demoralized. Seeing such power, the soldiers were overcome with fear. And only Lord Gened tried to keep order in the ranks of the soldiers, ordering them to keep the line and prepare for defense. Hayes, who stood with a spear in the front row, addressed the Lord. The young man was clearly not ready for combat and had no choice. The boy began to complain that he would not be able to do what was required of him, especially since the part of his face where the prince had hit him was still sore and in such a state it was impossible to do anything. From the height of the horse's seat, the Lord watched the advancing enemy army. He wondered if his decision was right or if it would be better to retreat. With one eye he noticed a glow behind him. It was a masked priest whose aura spread over the army. Both Gened and his men saw the power of the goddess Gaia and began to hope that the priest would save them. The holy water began to swirl around the prince, creating a water stream that spread around him. The prince activated the epidemic weakening skill. Alan asked Gaia to bless all those who would fight against evil today. The morale of the soldiers increased as soon as they saw their weapons being strengthened by the holy water. Even Lord Gened did not hide his joy and hope for the power of the priest and the goddess Gaia. As soon as the two armies met in close combat, it was clear that the advantage was not gained by the more numerous dead but by the humans, who were able to easily slaughter the zombies with their enchanted weapons. Cutting and piercing the enemies, the soldiers slowly moved forward, forcing the zombies to retreat. In the midst of this chaos, Harmon prepared his spell. He called upon Haim, the god of war, to share his power with the knight. As soon as the spell was read, the boy's sword shone. With a single blow to the ground, the knight created a shock wave of incredible power. The wave not only tore apart the nearby zombies but also created a crater in the place where the sword hit the ground. Harmon was thinking that the prince is now raising the morale of the soldiers while the knight has a different task. Now is the best time to execute the plan to eliminate the leader of wickedness, this chance could not be missed. The vampire count stood up in rage, his terrifying aura began to manifest around him. Watching his soldiers being slaughtered, the count gritted his teeth in a fit of rage. The prince's magic blocked the count's path, and the vampire could no longer contain his anger. At this time, Harmon began to accumulate energy for another aimed volley of holy power. The knight was ready to attack the count, but the vampire was instantly behind the knight. In one leap, the count covered a huge distance, all in order to destroy the priest who had been bothering him so much. The vampire's heart began to fill with dark energy, and his body changed. After a few seconds of metamorphosis, King Amon's skull grew into a count, and the fat vampire's body stretched out to become slender and muscular, with only the cloak hanging on his back. The giant monster with sharp claws loomed over the battlefield, terrifying the numb soldiers. The count roared as he looked at the little people, wondering if they really thought they could stop him. He used only one hand to crush the soldier who had the temerity to fall into the vampire's clutches. The soldiers were stunned by what they saw, by the sight of the giant who had just crushed their comrade. Drinking another bottle of holy water, the prince thought about further actions. He knew perfectly well that the count was luring Alan out in the first place. Just as Alan sees the mana flows, the count sees the boy's holy power, so the prince could be spotted at any time. After drinking the fourth bottle of holy water, the prince decided to change his location. He needed to move to a more convenient place to provide himself with good cover. But before he could run 10 steps away, something massive fell near him, creating a wave of falling objects that almost killed the prince, but he managed to jump away. It was a vampire count. In a few jumps he managed to cover a huge distance and catch up with the prince. The shock wave made Alan lose his balance and fall to the ground. The guy tried to take cover, but it was too late. The count had already seen him and was preparing to finish off the annoying insect. Shouting about the death of the priest, the count began to accumulate energy in his mouth, preparing to shoot. But despite his fear, the prince clearly assessed his situation. He expected this scenario, so he was ready to move on to Plan S. Charlotte, is what Alan shouted out in a moment of danger. Waiting for the signal, the girl jumped out of the shelter. She held a piece of a massive wall above her head. And now the energy was accumulated. A stream of energy flew out of the vampire's mouth, hitting the target. A volley of energy raised into the air clubs of doom and fire. Putting a piece of the wall as a shield in front of the prince, the girl was holding the improvised barrier with all her might so that he and she would not be thrown away by the vampire's powerful attack. Looking at the girl, Alan did not think to doubt her power. The frail-looking girl was able to lift a massive piece of the building and even jump a long distance with it. But her strength was not enough to hold back the count's beam. A stream of purple flames crashed into the shield. Flames lined the edges of the wall and tried to break through. Slowly but steadily, even the stone began to melt, becoming magma. Charlotte did her best to hold back the onslaught of the magical attack, but the pressure was slowly pushing her back. As the prince tried to get up, he praised the girl in his mind. Her plan was quite good, but the count's magic was too strong. The wall would not last long. The boy's thoughts were getting darker. Charlotte was still unable to control her power to use it effectively. If this continues, both the prince and the girl will be melted by the magic beam. Suddenly, the girl saw a man running to her aid. It was Grill. Standing next to the girl and leaning against the wall, the man spoke to the girl. Drops of sweat were running down the man's face. Together they had a chance to survive. Grill said that he did not know how to fight with swords and was not much use at all, but how could he leave his daughter in danger? The prince's voice sounded behind him. He asked Grill how he was going to help being such a weakling. Without waiting for an answer, Alan touched the backs of his friends and began to accumulate strength. Although the prince had not achieved great success in controlling and retaining the divine power, he still wanted to try to magically strengthen the wall that had already begun to crack. Alan began to recite the spell. He asked Gaia to give him the power to protect the people. He also asked for protection to stop the army of the dead. The prince sincerely appealed to the goddess, asking for forgiveness and love. After that, he screamed, asked for help, and directed all his strength into the barrier. The blue extra appeared around the boy and began to form a magical shield in front of the wall. The shield completely absorbed the Count's attack and created a dome around the people. The vampire was surprised by the guy's strength, and the most interesting thing was yet to come. The sphere began to accumulate simply unrealistic amounts of holy power, and then the sphere exploded, scattering flames of purification around. Hundreds of fragments flew around. The wall of dust was so thick that it was impossible to see anything. Charlotte appeared in a cloud of smoke, shouting for the prince and Uncle Grill. Because of the dust in her eyes, she did not immediately notice Grill's body lying nearby. The girl was seriously frightened and wanted to run to the boy's aid, but the prince's hand on her shoulder stopped Charlotte. Alan said that the guy was fine, he just fainted, so there was no need to panic. After the prince's words, the girl turned her attention to him, asking if he was okay. The prince replied that he was extremely exhausted and had the feeling that he was going to die soon, but that he was fine. Not far away, a vampire count was burning in pain. Even the explosion of holy power could not kill him, but he was severely burned and the skull of King Amon flew off his face. Looking at the count, the prince said that now they had a chance. Misunderstanding Alan, Charlotte objected to him, saying that they had too little strength to finish off the enemy, who was still a threat. The prince agreed with the girl and clarified that he had no plans to attack the enemy, he had run out of holy water, so their current plan was to leave the battlefield and escape. Alan ordered the girl to take Grill and run after him. The prince had planned to go underground to regroup and replenish the holy water that had run out so untimely. As he searched the soldiers nearby, something strange caught his eye. Dark mana began to swirl around the king's skull. The prince thought it was rather strange that the energy was gathering not near the vampire count but near an artifact lying nearby. From the expression on his face, it was clear that Alan had guessed the power of this object. Putting aside Charlotte's fear and caution, the prince approached the skull and took it in his hands. The young man remembered that this was the skull that the count had worn on his collar when he commanded his army, but he did not know the powers of this object. Using his skill that showed the characteristics and description of the object, Alan learned that he was looking at the skull of the necromancer King Amon. The magical power of the one who uses it increases by 20 to 200%. It depends on each standard, and the mana recovery rate is 10%. All effects related to magic are increased by 10%. Not far away, the count got to his feet and began to look around. His body had almost regenerated all the damage, although his eye and a few other places still burned with blue flames. Only now did the count realize that the skull of the king of the dead was not on him. A few seconds of searching and the vampire saw the prince holding the artifact. Seeing the boy bring the skull closer and closer to his face, the count rushed at him with insulting shouts. The vampire did not mince words, so insults flew at the prince in the style of, "You bastard, give me the skull," but Alan did not seem to notice anything. After he looked at the item's characteristics, he realized how to use this power. Putting on the skull mask, 2 information windows appeared, informing him that the acceleration was unstable due to lack of magical powers and that he was wearing temporary reinforcing equipment. The count was not in time. An aura of unprecedented power covered the prince, and the vampire looked at him as if he were seeing a new king of Lich. Every movement of Alan in this form radiated greatness and power. The boy said that he was the Legion. The prince uttered a new spell, Emperor of Gaia's Legacy, and activated it. Blue fire flashed from the place where the eye socket is located in the skull and holy chains appeared around the body as if chaining the prince. The count's claws were already near Alan's head when a whirlwind of chains rushed towards the vampire and pierced his wrists and legs, after which the chains completely wrapped around the count, preventing him from moving. Being chained, the vampire began to be terrified of his fate. The count clearly smelled the death that was already near him. His attempts to get out of the room were unsuccessful and all he could do was accept his fate. In an instant, the army surrounded the count and began to speak to him, calling him a heretic who had broken the rules of this world. Looking closely, the vampire saw that they were not just soldiers but skeletons in the armor of the Order of Light. They were holy knights raised by the new power of the prince. The skeletons were filled with holy power and one of the eye sockets was burning with blue flames. They turned to their lord asking him to give an order. The mask of the king of the dead took on the size of a human head, so it fit well on the prince's head. The eye socket of the skull burned with holy power. The count was desperate. He claimed that it was Alan who broke the rules of this world because the dead are endowed with holy power is nonsense. He had never heard of anything like it, and by doing so, the prince and his dead betrayed the will of Judah, the god of the dead. While the count was talking, the prince came up to him and put the muzzle of a gun to his head. The prince was also somewhat surprised by the effect of the king's skull, but he did not care now. The prince began to pronounce the sentence, on behalf of the priest and the holy power. Merry Christmas, vampire. At the last moment of his life, the count noticed the prince's smile even under the mask. The holy energy that had been accumulating in the gun was released with a blue flash, a flash so powerful that for a moment everything in the courtyard disappeared in the light. As soon as the glow began to fade, the whole picture of what the prince had done was revealed. The vampire's empty eye sockets and the huge hole in his head proved the power of the prince's new power. The shotgun shot did not give the enemy a chance. Half of the count's head seemed to be gone. Tired Alan fell to his knees. The boy drained his power records to the last drop, and then he needed only rest. Before he lost consciousness, he saw the reward for his efforts. The vampire and all the dead in Lonia began to disintegrate into dust to the delight of the soldiers who had survived the attack. Harman Dien passed by a group of rejoicing soldiers. The knight was looking for the prince and his company. His search was not long, as his target found him. Charlotte ran into the knight while carrying Grill and Alan to safety. They looked comical as the girl carried the men like sacks of potatoes, or like a hen gathering chickens under her wings, i.e. catching the men with each hand and putting them under her armpits. A few miles from Lonia's estate, close enough to see the walls, a detachment of holy knights stopped. The leader of the knights asked his subordinates if they were late. He was told that they were, and that they had not arrived in time to help. The battle was already over. A gray-haired, bearded man with a huge two-handed hammer behind his back led a knights mounted squad. He had heard that there had been a surge of abnormal magical activity in the lands of the dead, and assumed that it could be the rebirth of a necromancer king, but fortunately the knight was wrong. It turned out that it was just an ordinary vampire using his tricks. But the warrior had one question. How did the vampire manage to gather and control 20,000 zombies? The voice of the soldier behind him said that Lonia's military force was mainly made up of prisoners and residents of the estate. And judging by the above, the vampire was very weak if he couldn't defeat a bunch of prisoners and a few villagers. Perhaps vampires are not as strong as they are said to be. But still, the situation seemed strange to the leader. The atmosphere he felt when he arrived in the city was nothing but traces of the struggle of magical forces on a huge scale. If this vampire had so much magic, who could defeat him? The answer came from the squad that it was probably one of those who considered himself a priest. The leader agreed with this assumption. He wanted to believe it because over time, vampires learn to disguise themselves and change their appearance to human, so they blend in with the crowd, so it would be better if the knights had a priest or priestess on their side. The leader of the guard continued to express his opinion. God divided himself into parts for fun and to awaken the sacred power in people. Therefore, it is difficult to find such people and it is not so easy to awaken the power. The subordinate knight said that no one in the manor had such power. Turning his horse and preparing for the return journey, the leader gave his last order, namely to send priests, alchemists and doctors to help the wounded soldiers and civilians, and when the work with the former was completed, then proceed to treat the prisoners. The group of knights saluted the leader and proceeded to the task. One of the knights was careless enough to stop the captain and make him angry with one unwise question. The knight mentioned the seventh prince and asked if the old man wanted to meet him. But seeing the captain's expression change dramatically, he bowed and apologized for his rash question. The captain may have met the prince, but never again. The leader said in a half-hearted voice that he did not need to meet with a child who had dishonored his mother. Then the man repeated his order again and added that he had to go back. The words about the cursed grandson were what came out of the commander's mouth. Looking at this gray-haired and stately man, full of strength and strong muscles, you would not think he was 105 years old. But the main thing that is difficult to guess is that he is the Celtic Alphastus, the Holy Emperor. The Emperor was ready to bet that during the invasion of the undead, the prince was shaking with fear in defense of his estate. After a while, in his palace, the Emperor listened to the report of Commander Harmond. The knight's report was short: the vampire was defeated by the seventh prince. What he heard threw the Celt off balance. He got up from the throne and asked the knight. The nobility in the throne room began to whisper among themselves. The seventh prince could not defeat a vampire, even jokes have a limit. Another nobleman said that what he heard from the knight was the most ridiculous thing he had heard this year. The emperor wiped his eyes and frowned. He asked Harmond if they were talking about the same person or different ones. The knight confirmed that they were talking about Alan Elphos. Standing on one knee and holding his hand over his heart, the knight began to assure them that while the soldiers and the people of Lonia were fighting the undead, it was the prince who had defeated the vampire. When the emperor heard this report, he was angry and smashed the armrest of his throne with his palm. He addressed the knight with the following words: "The emperor considered Harmond to be a loyal man, but it seems that this is not the case." The emperor could not contain himself and shouted at the boy, asking him to kill the knight right now. A dark aura enveloped his highness, and his face burned with anger. The bewildered knight did not expect such a reaction. The emperor's words were tactfully interrupted by an old man standing next to him with a cough. The old man added that the emperor seemed to be in a bad mood today. The man then turned to Harmond, as the latter must have known, it could not happen that the seventh prince would defeat a vampire, no. A gray-haired, tall man with thick eyebrows and a beard that almost reached the ground. It turned out to be the centenarian Archbishop Raphael Astoria. A hail of insults flew in the direction of the prince. A snotty, selfish and weak man with no manners or common sense, how can we believe that he could accomplish such a feat? As the knight expected, being on the prince's side was difficult. He would not have believed it himself if he had not seen it with his own eyes. Bowing once again, the knight added that he was only talking about what he had seen and nothing more. The archbishop defended the knight by saying that there was another report. According to it, the inhabitants of Lonia also defended the seventh prince, and some also called the prince a priest. After saying that, Raphael suggested checking everything again. Perhaps this was due to the strange energy that the emperor felt last time near Lonia. After listening to the advice, the emperor asked Raphael if he believed that the power belonged to the seventh prince. But the advisor denied this statement. The archbishop was simply trying to prevent the seventh prince from stealing and appropriating someone's glory. After thinking about the situation, the emperor turned to the knight. He did not know whether the boy was lying or telling the truth, but in any case, everyone who defended the territory of the Lonius estate should be recognized and rewarded. Therefore, by imperial decree, Lord Genid Lepania is awarded the title of Count for his services to the throne. And the Holy Knight Harmond Dianus was given a small land area in the northwest of the region. As the last reward of the emperor, Celt Alphastus decided to reduce the time of the seventh prince's exile. After the prince fully regained his strength, the emperor promised to return him to the castle. After receiving the emperor, the knight decided to visit his prince. It was night time, so the boy traveled with a candle. When he reached the prince's room, the knight announced that he had returned and, after being allowed to enter, opened the door. Only one candle was burning in the room. When Harmond saw the prince, he asked if the prince was feeling better, to which the latter replied that it was a funny joke for someone whose death would mean nothing to others. The prince was completely wrapped in bandages that gradually allowed blood stains to pass through, with only his blue eyes and lips open. But even the light from the candle was enough to see the exhausted face of the first prince, one Alphals, now 27 years old. The prince spoke to the knight again, telling him that his eyesight and hearing had deteriorated again, so he didn't have much time to talk, so he invited the knight to come closer. The prince had already heard what had happened on the battlefield, so when Harmond approached the bed, he grabbed the boy by the collar with all his strength. From such a surprise, the tray with a candle fell out of the knight's hand. "You were protecting the seventh prince from his majesty," the prince shouted. Not hearing an answer, the prince repeated to Harmond whether he was defending Alan, this trash who defiled the honor and name of their mother who sacrificed everything for them. The prince stared at the knight's expression with his eyes bulging. Then the prince asked if Harmond was in his right mind. When the prince got up from the bed, he managed to catch the knight and with his other hand, overcoming the pain, one continued to tell Harmond off. The boy shouted at the knight, saying that because the prince looked like a living dead man, Harmond decided to side with the seventh prince. Harmond started to justify himself, but Luan interrupted him. The prince's eyes were bloodshot and his face was twisted with anger. The first prince said that the knight had taken the wrong path by choosing that scoundrel, he would never be the next one, but this time Harmond interrupted the prince. With an embarrassed but still confident face, the knight addressed his majesty, saying that due to the strain his wounds had reopened and the bandages were no longer able to hold back the blood. Hearing Harmond's words, the prince seemed to come out of a trance. All anger and rage disappeared from his face, and a sad smile replaced them. The first prince apologized to the knight. The prince knew very well that Harmond was not such a person, but for a moment his anger had taken over. The knight replied that the prince did not need to apologize, neither he nor the seventh prince were to blame for anything. Harmond's eyes looked down. In the end, the knight considered himself to be responsible for the death of Her Majesty Lucia. And no matter what orders the knight had received, Harmond believed that in that situation he had to stand his ground and stay to defend the royal family. The prince denied what the knight said. If he had not followed the order and stayed with them, no one would have survived that night. The prince reminded the knight that the first and seventh princes survived only because of the help of the reinforcements brought by Harmond. Because of this curse, the first prince's skin was bleeding and, as he himself said, he was no more useful than a corpse. The prince had endured the pain long enough to get used to it, so now he could talk about his condition and weakness with a smile. Harmond turned to the first prince. Having attracted his attention, the knight asked if the first prince really hated the seventh prince. Luan replied that he did, and he really hated Alan. Isn't it obvious why the knight asked such obvious questions? The prince continued by saying that Alan had humiliated their family, and now he was mindlessly living the life that their precious mother had given him. After waiting for a moment, the knight gathered the courage to express his opinion. What if maybe the seventh prince made himself a scoundrel? What if he hid his true motives to exact revenge for the death of Lady Lucia? And to gain strength, he acted like a bastard. He deliberately achieved his exile. After listening to the knight, the prince asked if he was all right. Hammond must have been wounded more than the prince thought. The prince wanted him to rest if he was tired, but the knight refused. Hammond told the prince that he still had to fulfill His Majesty's order. Soon he would have to go to Lonia's estate again. The prince had nothing against the emperor's order. But if Harmond is going to Lonia, the seventh asshole must be back soon, the prince thought with a cold look. 3 weeks after the wave of deaths, work was in full swing in Lonia Manor. Even a man like Grill had a shovel to fit, so the boy worked with all his might. After weeks of cleaning the streets and clearing the rubble, Lonia could finally be called a normal village. Looking towards the sun, Grill reflected on the lack of compensation. There would be no reimbursement for what they had put their lives at risk. Don't we have a duty to help each other in difficult situations? The man decided not to leave Charlotte in a place like this where lives are in danger and there is no reward for risk. The next moment he focused his gaze on a wooden box filled with old clothes brought from the basement and other things left by the dead, which Theo had collected. Bad thoughts began to enter the boy's mind. He thought that if these things belonged to people who had died long ago, no one would need them anymore. A spark of greed flashed in his eyes. Grill wanted to become the new owner of these things, and he told them about it. He was not embarrassed by the state of affairs because many of those things could be restored. Looking around, the boy began to quickly examine what he found until he found a necklace with a red stone. In his mind, he soothed his conscience by saying that it was just payment for his labor on the estate. The next thing that caught his attention was a piece of paper with a golden symbol. This sheet looked like a new one even though 100 years had passed. It must be expensive, the guy thought, looking at the find. The prince's room. Charlotte offered the prince to bring more food, but the prince refused. He was full as ever. The girl changed her usual clothes, namely a white shirt and black pants for a blue dress with white sleeves and a collar. Finishing the chicken leg, the boy thanked the girl and said that he had never eaten so deliciously before. Charlotte cleared the dishes and the food cart. The girl recalled the doctor's order, namely that when the prince woke up, he would need a lot of food to regain his strength after lying unconscious for a week. The prince agreed with the doctor's words. He saw the doctor himself and he ordered him to recuperate. The prince recalled a conversation with the doctor, who said that he believed that Alan's recovery was a real miracle. The doctor was a thin man with graying hair and glasses. He looked about 40 years old and wore the same clothes as all the priests in Lonia, namely a cloak and a mask of a plague doctor. The doctor's question was about how much holy power the prince had used. The amount of holy power that the prince used would have been enough to cripple Alan. But the boy recovered because of the holy power and the medicine he was given, and the doctor said it was amazing. The doctor continued, in his opinion, the prince's body was very exhausted, so he would have to spend the rest of his life in bandages, and there were a lot of bandages, almost the entire body of the boy was wrapped in them. The prince responded to what he heard with only one question, whether he could become a dead man. The doctor immediately noticed the terrible things the prince said. These were the doctor's personal methods of treatment, so he was sure of them. But Charlotte didn't like them, and she began to unwind the boy like a ball of thread. Adjusting his glasses and looking a little worried, the doctor said that to be honest, the man standing next to the prince looked much more like a dead man than a bandaged prince. These words caught their attention. While the prince was unconscious, the doctor managed to heal the girl who was now standing next to the prince. Sacred power and mana, perhaps the prince had something to do with it, with her condition, the doctor asked. Becoming a bit more serious, Alan asked if they had any problems. The doctor continued his story. A person can be cut, a limb can be chopped off and killed. An ordinary body cannot develop like this one, the man pointed to Charlotte. Looking at the girl's strength and resilience, the man seemed to see his imperial majesty 50 years ago. After his majesty the emperor was in a coma after being defeated in a battle with the necromancer King Amun. His body was incredibly damaged by the holy power and mana, so as the doctor heard, the emperor had to be reassembled from pieces. At that time, his body developed beyond all human limits. According to rumors, the reason for the emperor's victory over the king of the dead was his supernatural strength and his invincible body. Could an ordinary person have the same strength as the emperor, was the question the doctor asked himself. Looking at Charlotte now, Alan assessed her. She was now 16 years old, a hard worker with high concentration and superhuman strength. Catching the prince's eyes on her, she asked what was wrong. At that time, the prince thought that it was people like her who should become heroes, not such deadbeats as the prince. A minute later, the prince said that he was bored, so he asked the girl to bring his books, and Charlotte agreed. Looking at her footprint, the boy was glad that he had received Amun's ability and the effect of the recoil was too strong. The prince's body could not cope with the new power. Sacred power needs to be used frequently and it is very difficult to do so because of the artifact's completely different mana. Therefore, to compensate for this, you need to start with theory. Charlotte has just brought the books Alan asked for. The Theory of Magic from the Sacred Emperor, The Sacred Power and the Dawn of the Doctrine of Revitalization, and a few other books. The author of these books was Rafael Astoria. Reading one of the books, the prince noticed that the book was written in the most accessible and informative way. The emperor dedicated this book to the goddess Gaia. Perhaps the emperor's faith is really strong, the boy thought. In any case, thanks to the books, the prince was going to learn how to control his holy powers and use zombies properly. All this time, Charlotte was there watching the boy. A knock sounded in the room, and hearing it, Alan allowed the guest to enter. The guest turned out to be Harmon Diaz. He heard that the prince had woken up and came. The boy addressed the knight. Several days had passed since the prince woke up, so the boy knew that the knight was in the emperor's castle, but he expected Harmon to return later. The knight confirmed that he was in the castle and said that he was in a great hurry to tell Alan the news. The prince remembered that Harmon had given him a considerable amount of money for his previous victory over the witch. So the prince began to hope for something similar, or at least a vacation, but the knight did not live up to his expectations. Harmon gave a direct and personal order from His Majesty the Holy Emperor. The seventh prince was ordered to return to the castle. Alan's surprise knew no bounds. But the knight's surprise was no less, and Harmon was immediately put into the corridor and the door was closed, and the prince held the door from the inside to make sure he didn't break through. Already in the corridor, the knight repeated that the prince needed to return. Charlotte, who was still in the room, noticed that someone was talking outside the door. In response, Alan asked the girl to just ignore the voice. From behind the door, the knight kept trying to shout to His Majesty. But the prince had already left the door and headed back to bed. Charlotte looked at the boy's action and asked if he really did not want to return to the castle. The prince replied that of course not, why would he want to return to such a dangerous place? A memory of the witch Morgana and her last words appeared in the boy's mind. Namely, her promise to give away the customers for the prince's murder in exchange for his life. He didn't know exactly who was behind it, and he had to find out before killing her, but it was too late to regret it. Already lying in bed, the prince started a conversation with the girl. The prince ordered her to ignore the knight. Harmon decided to find a way out of this situation. He tried all available ways of communication. But everything turned out to be not so simple, but even in the situation of isolation of the prince, the knight did not give up. Harmon kept asking and asking. Alan was not at ease, as always reading a book on the windowsill. The prince was not able to concentrate on the knight's upturned face. Harmon hung from the ledge upside down just to be able to watch the prince through the window and ask the prince to go with him. He could not enjoy his food either, as in many dishes he could find notes asking him to return to the castle with the knight. This persecution affected the prince so much that he hid under the covers. After a while, Charlotte went out into the corridor to deliver the message to Harmon. The knight was already excited that the prince would return to the castle with him, but he was wrong. The girl tried to convey the message as accurately as possible, so she made a very mincing expression and told the knight to get lost before he was sprinkled with salt. After these words, embarrassment spread in the room. Harmon broke the silence and asked if Charlotte was going home and if it was unnecessary to spend the night because it was getting late. The girl replied that although she and her father, and she stumbled a little at the mention of Grill, had been given a house outside the castle, she did not need help. When the knight heard the girl's answer, he said directly that he just wanted to know the reason why Alan did not want to return to the castle, and perhaps Charlotte had heard something about it. So he went with her to her house. The girl did not hide anything. She said that according to the prince, the castle was a rather dangerous place. Harmon agreed that the situation in the castle was not the best, but, without listening to the knight's words, the girl was deep in thought. Charlotte already had suspicions that the prince's relationship with his family was not the best. Someone wants to kill Alan. Charlotte wanted to be stronger. Her thoughts were about the possibility of gaining strength and her current weakness, but she was prevented from sinking into depression by the greeting of Grill, who was already waiting for her at the house. The man added to his greeting that she was late tonight and only then noticed the holy knight, with whom he also greeted. Harmon wondered if Grill had fought as fiercely in the manner as he had in Morgan, so he asked the man. It was clear from Grill's behavior that he did not like the question, but he answered that of course he had fought his enemies, and that people should help each other. Grill was about to leave, but Harmon stopped him. He praised Grill and offered to tell him, if he didn't mind, what exactly he did on the battlefield. As usual, even though he was working up a sweat, Grill did not stop lying. He told the gullible knight that he had just killed 50 huge zombies and took the vampire's fangs. And the knight believed it. Meanwhile, Charlotte had already entered the house. The further conversation of the men was interrupted by Charlotte, who saw a document on the table that she had not seen before, so she took it and decided to ask Grill, despite Harmon's presence, what she had found. To lie, the man said it was his lucky charm, which he hadn't had for a long time. The man felt sick. He shook more than before and in a panic added that the sheet looked old because he hadn't used it for a long time, and then added that of course he hadn't stolen it if that's what the girl meant. But Charlotte did not pay attention to his words because, after a little scanning, she realized that it was a family document with the seal of the Hiray's family. The Herais are the family that defended the territory of Lonia 50 years ago. This family was wiped out in a deadly battle by the necromancer King Amun. There was no one as loyal to the emperor as they were, which is what the document of the bravest family in the kingdom does here. Perhaps these two surviving members of the Herais family. Thoughts of this filled Harmon's head. Looking at the girl picking up the necklace from the table and talking to Grill about something, the knight came to a logical conclusion. Harmon interpreted what he saw as follows. Imagining Grill cutting giants in two and remembering Charlotte's strength, the knight thought that these two were descendants of that family, and although they now live in the shadows because of the family's defeat in the battle with Amun, they still care about the prince, although no one knows about it. It must be because of their endless loyalty to the emperor, the boy thought. Meanwhile, Charlotte found a bunch of new things that hadn't been there before. Various statuettes, documents, daggers. The girl, suspicious of her foster father, asked him once again if he had really brought all these things from home, to which Grill replied with a fake smile that he had. Seizing the opportunity when Charlotte and Grill stopped talking, Harmon addressed them formally, saying that he respected the desire to keep their mission a secret from everyone. Grill, not understanding anything, asked what the knight was talking about. As soon as the knight realized that he was misunderstood, he decided to go the other way, so he put his hand to his chest and asked to accept the letter of recommendation. His words sounded like this. You could help improve your daughter's skills, and Charlotte still wants to be with the seventh prince. I will write you a letter of recommendation later. The last knight's words knocked the ground from under Charlotte and Grill's feet. Coming closer to the knight, Grill clung to this opportunity. He asked again if the girl could really go to the castle. Harmon answered positively. She would be able to become a holy knight, and from there it would be a stone's throw away from becoming an aristocrat. Turning to the girl, Diaz gave her an incentive. If she wanted to, she would be taught the art of swordplay practiced in the Holy Empire. And she, in turn, could be more useful to His Highness the Prince. Without hesitation, the girl agreed and immediately added that if she had to be away from the prince when she became a holy knight, she would refuse. Harmon replied that if her duty was to protect the prince, then he would work even harder to protect the prince with her. And in his mind he continued that he would do whatever it took to escort the Herais family and the prince to the castle. When the knight caught the prince again at the entrance to Alan's room, the boy's words seemed incomprehensible. Alan said, "Let's go. I'm ready to go to the castle." A closed carriage drawn by two horses was heading down the road to the castle, accompanied by Harmon on his horse and Grill riding behind. As the knight approached the carriage window, he asked why the prince had changed his mind so suddenly. Just yesterday, the boy had closed the door in front of the knight because he did not want to return to the castle. To answer this question, the prince plunged into his recent memories. Lying in his room, the prince was reading a book. This book, he said, was wonderful. How did the authors even think of using the sacred power in such a way? If I can practice this. But the prince did not rejoice for long, because the book that interested him was only the first volume. The most interesting things were to come. He had to look for a sequel. Charlotte, who was also riding in the carriage and sitting opposite, was also interested in the answer. Having stopped remembering, Alan replied that he had changed his mind because the royal library had all the books he needed. And he added that he had almost bought cookies. In the Korean program, you need to buy cookies to quickly read the next episodes, and one cookie costs 101. Harmon assumed that the prince was focused on learning magic. Without reacting to the knight, the prince said that if he was only getting stupid and contemptuous looks in the castle, he would just lock himself in the library. Diaz did not share the prince's concern and advised the boy to relax. It had been a long time since the prince's last visit to Laurentiis. These lands are much more fertile than the lands of the dead, so there is plenty of entertainment to be found here. As soon as the coachman announced that they were close, Alan and Charlotte leaned out of the carriage window to get a better look at the capital. The streets were bustling with life. Men, women and children were running here and there, each going about their business. The clothes of the townspeople were also characterized by simple elegance and style. Harmon, who was clearly amused to see the prince's interest in the city, added that the capital had changed a great deal since he had been away. But when he looked closely, he saw that the boy's mood had changed. As he got into the carriage, the prince frowned and only one word came out of his mouth: "It stinks." Covering his nose with a handkerchief, Alan asked the knight a question. He asked if there were any dead people in the capital of the sacred country. Unable to endure the stench of death any longer, the prince ran out of the carriage and into the street. He did not pay attention to the cries of his friends who ran after him and tried to stop him, nor to the passers-by whom he pushed aside to run ahead. Charlotte and Hammond, who were running behind, apologized to an apple seller whom the prince had pushed so hard that she lost her balance and fell. They didn't have time to help her now, so they continued on their way. The street was going on with its own life, and they could hear the conversations of various merchants and people everywhere. Someone was talking about their cheap goods, someone suggested going to the bakery on the next street for delicious bread, they had incredible croissants. For others, it was just a crowded street, and the prince was sure he could smell a vampire. Guided by the stench left behind by the vampire, Alan intended to find him. At that moment, a knight and a girl caught up with the prince and asked him what he had smelled, what could have confused him so much that he was running away. But the prince did not answer. And now the smell was very close. Turning the corner, Alan saw the source of the stench. A wooden box was decorated with a wreath of flowers on top, and inside the wreath, the head of a young man with long hair, and tears were running down his cheeks from his closed eyes. As soon as the prince's group stopped in surprise, the head, which had been lying still, opened its eyelids to hide its red eyes, it changed from a human form to that of a dead man and began to scream furiously. People were forced to cover their ears from the force of the sound. Only the prince was able to resist the monster. He used his holy power to call upon a shovel and cut the monster's trunk in half. Charlotte concluded that it was a dead man, and Harmond confirmed it, as he had heard of similar cases and wanted to see for himself. At that time, the prince's attention was drawn to the body of the dead man, hanging on the clothesline. Looking closely, the prince realized that the internal organs had been removed from the body and only the skin remained. From around the corner, an unknown voice whispered that the prince had been followed all along. Immediately leaving the knight to examine the discovery, he began to look around for the mysterious interlocutor. Harmond noticed a change in the prince's behavior, so he asked what had confused the young man again. The prince began to tell him about a middle-aged man with red hair whom he had seen. The knight asked for an explanation, and the prince replied that the man had just been there and had probably run away. Looking towards the place where the unknown man was, the knight suggested that this was probably the culprit. Lowering his head, the prince agreed with the knight's opinion, and it was impossible to track the man because the stench had already spread through the neighborhood. Harmond said that he would report what had happened when they arrived at the castle. The prince was not happy about what happened and what he was involved in. After all, he had only come here to learn more about magic. The prince was in a bad place. The sun began to set, casting a shadow over the big city. Lawrence was in chaos. It turned out that this murder was not the first, there were several such cases. Because of this, chaos broke out in the streets, and the return of the seventh prince started chaos in the castle. The man who had become the subject of gossip, that is, Alan, entered the castle in complete safety, and Harmond asked the prince to stand still. He had already reported on the story that had happened in the capital, so all he demanded from the prince was that he do nothing until the end of the banquet tomorrow. The prince was outraged. He had already told him so many times that he was not going anywhere, and that Harmond kept repeating the same thing as if he hadn't understood the first time. The boy even said that he was not a child anymore, and that the knight replied that he was still a little boy. Charlotte took this opportunity to express her desire to see the castle. Harmond agreed and added that if anyone asked who she was from, she should say that she was from the vice-captain of the saints in the army. The girl agreed, and the prince decided to have a look around the library. As he walked, the prince felt like a child as he heard detailed instructions from the knight on how to get to the library, and assurances from the girl that as soon as she finished walking around the castle, she would definitely come to him. Walking through the corridors of the castle, the prince thought about the stench he could still smell. Probably a vampire had somehow gotten into the castle. The smell was terrible, so he decided to sit quietly as the knight said. Alan also had an option to escape from the castle as soon as he found the right book. It would be better than being drawn into the castle intrigues. After passing several turns and halls, the prince realized that he was walking in circles, he was lost. So he went out into the inner garden where a statue of a woman with a bouquet caught his attention. Wanting to know more, the guy came closer and read the name on the plaque. It was a statue of Lucia. From the inscription, the prince realized that the person in whose honor the monument was erected had died long ago, but the boy's thoughts were interrupted by a voice complaining of back pain. Looking behind the statue, the boy saw a gardener. He complained that he had relied on helpers who eventually forced the old man to do everything himself. Wearing a straw hat and holding garden shears, the man said out loud that he could cut the culprits' necks and use them as jewelry. Of course, the prince's first thought was that this old man was some kind of murderer. The bearded man continued his complaints, this time complaining about the laziness of his assistants. These people are paid from the taxes of ordinary people, and they are so lazy. The man turned sharply and addressed Alan. The old man said that the boy was in exile, he should have come to greet him right away. The boy was somewhat surprised. But before he could think about it, the gardener ordered him to bring him a bag of soil and a shovel. The boy objected, saying that he was being chased by the gardener, but remembering the old man's words about the head ornaments that would hang on the tree, he agreed to the request. The work was not easy. Trembling with his whole body, Alan tried to carry the bag of earth. His only support was a shovel, which he leaned on with one hand. Looking at the boy's efforts, the emperor assumed that he was not recognized and confused with the gardener because of the clothes he was wearing. When the prince had finished his work, he turned to the old man and asked if it was enough. The emperor started to say that the prince had misunderstood who he was and was about to leave, but Alan saw the man's dirty hands and offered him his handkerchief. Pulling out the handkerchief, the man said that it was not his at all. Charlotte had given it to him, but still. Then he added that the old man should try not to work alone and ask for help from others. But when he stretched out his hand with the handkerchief, the old man caught him by the sleeve and pulled him closer. The guy panicked. "What are you doing?" he screamed, but they ignored him. Still holding the boy's wrist, the old man talked to himself. "It seems you have really lost your memory. And not only your character has changed, you couldn't even recognize your own grandfather." The man took off his hat to see his face better. The boy stared intently at the dark figure towering over him. It was the Emperor of the Holy Empire and his grandfather. Standing behind the massive doors, the prince was preparing for an audience with the emperor. He could hear the whispers and gossip of those already in the reception hall. The door opened and a soldier announced that the seventh prince had arrived. The boy entered. Alan still couldn't believe that the strange old man was the Holy Emperor. Sitting on his throne, the emperor praised the boy for helping to defend the Lonia estate from a zombie attack. There were also rumors that the prince had managed to defeat a vampire count, so the emperor wanted to make sure he heard it and asked the boy if it was true. The prince began to think about his answer. Even the people of Lawrence had heard about the incidents. This meant that the emperor must have known about it, that there was a vampire behind the heads without bodies, so right now, instead of recognizing Alan's achievements in Lonia, the emperor plans to find someone who can catch the vampire. So he is checking the details of the case. The answer was straightforward. Alan confirmed that he had indeed destroyed the vampire. But the guy took advantage of the emperor's confusion and added to it that he would not be able to catch the vampire on his own, even if he died and was reborn again. "I was able to do this only with the help of a lot of people. Harmond, Charlotte, and Lord Jennett all contributed to the victory. Also, the people of Lonia Manor were of great help in the battle. It was not only my strength. The prince did everything to share the credit and responsibility, everything to avoid problems that might arise." The emperor's face was gloomy. The prince even thought he saw irritation. But the emperor simply accepted his report and sent him off to recuperate after his long journey. In parting, Alan wished the vampire hunt to be completed as soon as possible. This surprised the emperor. Perhaps he had learned about the vampire from Harmond. Recalling the incident of 6 months ago, when, after the prince's breakdown, he was dragged out of the hall. The emperor noticed the striking changes that had taken place. Now Alan accepts outside help with dignity, and can notice the existence of vampires in the country's capital. Continuing his thoughts, the emperor asked himself if someone loses their memory or if their character changes. He also remembered Charlotte and Grill, who, according to Harmon's report, were the only survivors of the heresy family. If this is true, they must be quite skilled at hunting vampires, but the Herre's family has never been known for its fighting skills and holy power. The report that the emperor received from Lord Gened said that the seventh prince saved the lives of soldiers who were on the verge of death with the help of holy power. There was also a story that the goddess Gaia came down to answer Alan's prayer and helped him. And that he killed a vampire using a decorative gun. Despite the fact that the person who performed such miracles was wearing a mask, Lord Gened is sure that it was Alan. At first the emperor thought it was nonsense. When he asked the lords, most of them said that it was all a lie. The prince said that he had not been on the battlefield for a long time and it was all a mistake. Others said that the prince and the man in the mask had the same build. Most did not believe in such arguments. But how could the incredible divine power be explained if not by the fact that the blood of the emperor was flowing in that priest? The emperor was caught by the head. Soon he would need to vacate the throne in favor of someone younger, and unfortunately, he had no heir, but also no one who could help him now. The emperor remembered Lucius, and if not for the tragedy that happened that night, the first Prince Luan could have become the heir. But what happened. The emperor also felt part of the blame for that incident. He considered himself guilty of becoming cold, of thinking more about the security of the kingdom than about his grandchildren. Recalling Alan's reception today and his answers, the emperor began to think that the seventh prince might also be honored to have a chance to become heir. Returning to reality, all the emperor saw was an incredible argument that almost turned into a fight, everyone arguing about the truth of the prince's words. This made the old man so angry that he shouted and threatened that if they did not shut up they would get a fist in the face. The emperor instantly made the lords and advisors silky smooth and calm. Worthless idiots is what he called them. All the people could do was try to calm their king. Luan's friend, Count Palmer, a somewhat thin man with red hair and a white uniform, stood out from the crowd. He offered to investigate the matter better, they had enough time to do so. The man continued by reminding us that the anniversary of Lady Lucia's death would be in 2 months. And it would be great if the seventh prince stayed in the castle until then. And if he is going to help with the search for the vampire, why not let him rest before the soon-to-be-held feast? The emperor agreed with the lord and did everything he suggested. After a long search, the prince finally found the door to the library. Once inside, the boy grumbled that it was too difficult to get in. But his mutterings were interrupted by a voice from the library. Alan did not think anyone could be here at such a late hour. The maid apologized and was about to leave so as not to disturb the boy, but Alan stopped her. He noticed that the girl was very uncomfortable around him. Looking at the girl, he began to remember where he had seen her before. In a few seconds, he remembered his past courtship with the girl. Alice Astoria is a 17-year-old granddaughter of an archbishop, specializing in love and forgiveness, incredible sacred power and knowledge of magic, a fragment of God, foresight. No wonder she is so uncomfortable around me, she probably thinks that this pervert has come back for her. The girl blushed a little, trying not to look the prince in the eye. The girl could be called a beauty. Tall, beautiful face and long golden hair, noble birth and good manners. Everything you need for the title of beauty. Alan guessed that the reason for the girl's discomfort was his past actions. He believed that she still thought he was a pervert and that he had come back for her. As he watched the girl shift her books, as she moved her hair to the side so that it did not get in the way, he caught himself thinking that the girl's name, Rafael Astoria, is the same as the author of the book Alan is looking for. The prince assumed that the book he was looking for was written by an archbishop. The one whom the prince had called a slave of Gaia before he was banished because of the inscription on the corridor wall. Alan took hold of his head. Who knew that he would meet the author of the books in such a way? Because of the incident that had happened in the past, the hope for some help in understanding the book from the bishop faded like a light in the wind. The girl was somewhat frightened by the prince's movement. Noticing that Astoria jumped out of surprise, the boy apologized. He did not want to frighten the girl. He told her that he had lost his memory, so he did not remember most of the people in the castle. Astoria looked at him with contempt mixed with distrust. The prince noticed her look. He did not judge the girl. The boy would not have believed it himself if he were in her place. Having said that, Alan began to look around the library and look for the right books. When he reached the shelves, the prince found that the books he needed were missing. Seeing the prince's actions, Astoria came over and asked if the prince was looking for books written by her grandfather. The prince replied that he was. Alice decided to give him the book he needed. The girl had just read the book herself and seeing the prince looking for the tome, decided to finish reading it later and give it to the prince. Alan did not want to distract the girl and ask for help. But Astoria assured him that everything was fine. She was about to clean up and go about her business. Handing over the book, the prince read the title out loud. The book is about the resurrection. A loud name, the guy said. The girl, thinking it was some kind of reproach, began to justify herself that it was just a record of her grandfather's research, nothing special. First of all, you need to know that people cannot be resurrected at all. The prince was surprised and did not like the answer, and he asked her to explain why resurrection was impossible. And the girl began to tell him. No matter how much the holy powers give life, it is impossible to catch a soul that has already left the body. Only necromancy can do something like that. But because necromancy requires an incredible fee, it is not good to practice it. After listening carefully to the girl, Alan asked her what would happen if someone had both sacred and magical powers. What would happen then? The boy's question took the girl by surprise. Alice said that such cases are incredibly rare. If someone used the two powers ineptly, the body could simply explode. The prince wrote down every word of the girl. The guy came to the conclusion that resurrection is not something impossible and shared it with his interlocutor. Astoria did not agree with him. In her grandfather's book it was written that if a person wants to use the holy power better, he needs to pray more. Alan began to tell her that sorcerers use mana and spells, while dark magicians use magic powers and life. The boy asked, as if to himself, if there was a way to bypass the prayer and learn to use the holy power better. The girl replied that if Alan wanted to find a way better than prayer, he could use a magical tool. The girl wondered what the boy meant by saying that resurrection was theoretically possible. The prince didn't answer the question. He made a face and apologized for keeping Astoria waiting with his talk. It was getting late, so the prince put the book to the girl's shoulders and began to push her out, ignoring her objections. He also added that she was uncomfortable with him and he could see it clearly, so there was no need to deny it. The girl tried to convince him that this was not the case, but the prince did not give her the opportunity. Alan promised to turn off all the lamps before leaving and said good night. The girl waited in the corridor for a few more minutes, her confusion competing with her desire to continue the conversation about the resurrection. She was beginning to think that everything that had happened was just another one of the prince's delusions. But this time something was different about him. She felt that his aura had changed. But the girl's thoughts were interrupted by her grandfather's greeting. The archbishop was walking around the castle and met Alice. This tall and gray-haired man with a monocle on his left eye gave the impression of a harsh and angry man, and he spoke to Alice in a soft and gentle tone. The man asked his dear granddaughter what she was doing in this part of the castle so late, and she replied that she was studying in the library. The old man praised the girl's enthusiasm and said that he had been like that once, and then he warned Alice to be careful because the seventh prince was in the castle. Astoria tried to act surprised at what she heard. Raphael handed her a mask of a plague doctor and advised her not to overwork, then added that she had been chosen by a goddess and had an incredible talent, but the work she would have to do was very responsible. Holding the mask in her hands, the girl smiled. She knew her duty. Alice looked at her grandfather's wrinkled face. Astoria told him not to worry, that she was a strong girl and would handle everything. The old man could not be happy about his granddaughter. Leaning on his cane, he and Alice went to fulfill the order. On the way, they were joined by other masked priests. When they opened the door, the delegation saw the first prince screaming in incredible pain. Without wasting time, they began today's treatment. The holy power filled the room with radiance. The energy of the priests and Alice's prayers enveloped the prince's body, and the boy's pain did not subside, his screams seemed to become even stronger. Alice's thoughts were gloomy. The archbishop had told the truth about her talent, and even Alice's outstanding abilities were useless against the cursed body of the first prince. If this continued, the prince would not have much time left. The girl wanted to find a way out of the prince's fatal situation with all her heart. But the thought of resurrection did not leave her. She believed that resurrection was impossible. She knew this, but she wanted to believe otherwise. She wanted the prince's words to be true. Looking at the documents from the archive, the prince scolded Harmon for not having information about Alan's parents. The knight justified himself by saying that the prince must have remembered them, so there was no need to bring information about them. But the prince was angry that Harmon still believed that amnesia was just a fiction created by the prince. Alan once again assured him that he had lost his memory and asked him to tell him everything about his parents. The knight lowered his head and said only a few words, but that when they were alive they lived a beautiful and ordinary life. Harmon didn't answer the boy's questions anymore and said that he had told everything he knew. Alan looked at the knight and realized from the sweaty forehead and the look to the side that Harmon could not lie. The prince wanted to know the history of the royal family to better understand the relationships in his family. And the knight's silence looked very suspicious. But perhaps if it is the history of the royal family, it is not customary to talk about it right and left, that's what the prince thought. Harmon took advantage of Alan's silence to remind him of the banquet to which the prince was to attend. The boy did not really want to be there, but it was his duty. The knight said that if the prince did something wrong, they would laugh at him. And Charlotte learned the rules of etiquette in order not to embarrass Alan. The prince asked why he couldn't just have fun, and Harmon explained that a party and a banquet are two different things. But if there is a seventh prince this time, maybe the first prince will be able to attend. When Alan heard about the first prince, he asked who he was. The knight told him as much as he could about him, the prince's older brother Luan Elfos. The person to be wary of the most. As the conversation continued, the first prince got out of bed and prepared for the feast despite his wounds. The boy's gaze was like that of a dead man with only one wish, in his case, the wish to get to the feast. The banquet hall was packed with people. The elegance of the interior and decorations was truly royal. The golden chandelier seemed to dance to the melodies of the orchestra playing music. Alice also found a place in this hall, where she was talking to two high-ranking officials. The men were surprised at how quickly the girl had grown up and become a real beauty. The officials were glad to see the girl after a long time of her absence. Alice accepted the compliments and also showed joy at meeting the lords. The girl recalled how her grandfather had asked her not to go to the banquet. For him it did not matter in whose honor the banquet was called, because it would definitely be the seventh prince. But since Alice's grandfather could not come, she felt it was her duty to come at least by herself. Astoria was in the center of attention, and it was not surprising that the girl replaced her usual almost nun's clothes with a stylish white dress with a wide bottom and a blue cape. It suited her very well. The girl was called by Count Fulmer, who was just entering the hall. From there, the Count began to shower Alice with compliments. The Count equated Alice's beauty to that of a goddess, and if he said that she was a reincarnation of a goddess, everyone would believe it, since such beauty comes only from the gods. The Count was dressed in his usual red cloak over a gray and black vest and pants. The other nobles who saw the Count began to whisper that these days he was able to get the support of peasants and other workers. The support of the lower caste is difficult to get, and since the Count was not seeking power, the other nobles thought he was doing useless volunteer work. Alice heard these words and started to stand up for the Count, but Fulmer talked her out of it, telling her to leave the gossips alone and ignore them, because they were saying the wrong things. The Count smiled, although his face showed that he was uncomfortable. The man said that after his wife's death his only consolation and reason to live was his volunteer work, and he thought it was not very noble of him to have such an incentive. Fulmer seemed like a really good person. Alice disputed his words. She thought it was great that he was helping people and he should be respected for it. She thought that the Count was a really good guy who deserved more respect. In the past, he served Juliet and now he faithfully serves the first prince, Juan Elfos. Instead of seeking more power and honors, he is always concerned about the prince's health, and he is also a man who is passionate about the people. While listing Thomas's virtues, Alice found herself thinking that despite all his merits, she was somehow uncomfortable with him. The girl apologized and left the interlocutor, saying that she needed to meet someone else. The count let her go and wished that their next meeting would be as soon as possible. The girl was not feeling well and was distracted from her problems by a strange couple. They were Grill and Lord Lapin Jennett, who was very nervous because he was a country lord and did not expect to be invited to the royal castle. Grill just laughed at such a statement. The guy was just a peasant and behaved more courageously than the lord, which he told the latter. This situation made Astoria laugh. Finally, she saw good company, so she went over and said hello. Lepin immediately recognized the bishop's granddaughter. Alice confirmed this, and greeted him properly, announcing her full name and asking how she was known. Lapin replied that he had seen her once before, but only from a distance. Count Fomer was watching the conversation, and he was clearly not happy with the situation. But he didn't have time to do anything because the massive doors opened and the prince appeared with his delegation. The attention of the people was attracted and, not surprisingly, everyone looked beautiful. The prince was dressed in a white suit with a crimson cloak attached to the left side, and golden epaulets on his shoulders, golden cufflinks and a red tie decorated with a precious stone stood out. Harmon Diaz, in turn, wore a blue tailcoat with embroidery on the collar, with a black plain tie. Charlotte wore a red dress with a red patterned cape, a red belt with a white edge emphasized the girl's figure, and Charlotte tied her hair in a bun. Sitting on the couch, the prince was surprised that so many people would come to see the prince, who has no right to inherit the throne. But not only the prince was attracted to Charlotte, both men and women were looking at her, fascinated by her beauty. The prince was a little jealous of Charlotte because her etiquette lessons were a success and it looked like she was the real noblewoman, not him. The boy tried to tease the girl, saying that the etiquette lessons were useful, but Harmon said that perfect posture could not be taught. Alan frowned and asked the knight if he had any problems with his posture. Harmon evaded a direct answer by saying that he had not said anything bad about the prince's posture. The conversation was interrupted by Count Fomer, who greeted the audience. Charlotte and Harmon returned the greeting, and the prince only asked who was in front of him. The knight immediately began to reprimand the prince, pointing out that such behavior was not befitting a nobleman, and that he was facing one of the earls on Harmon's list, Earl Fomer. The count asked him to ignore the prince's prank. It had been a long time since their last meeting and it was no wonder that Alan had forgotten him. He apologized for his absence at a time when the prince was having a hard time. Without showing much enthusiasm, the prince shook hands with the count and told him not to exaggerate his guilt. The prince recalled that the dossier Harmon had given him said that the earl had once served the prince's mother, and that the man had supported both the first and seventh princes over the years. As soon as the prince began to tell him that he would never forget the kindness shown to him, he felt something strange, and when he opened the information window, he found out what it was. What he saw frightened the boy. Count Fomergia, age unknown, vampire race. Characteristics and skills of bloodsucking, black magic and body separation, is now in a thirsty state. The prince clearly felt the vampiric power of the count and several other nobles nearby. The energy covered the men's hands for a moment. Releasing their hands, the count asked if the boy liked the food or had any comments. But the prince replied that everything was fine and his thoughts were in the memories of the moment, and the boy unintentionally released the holy power from his hand and Fomer did not even move. The count was happy because it had been a long time since the prince had last eaten from the royal kitchen. The prince wondered how long this man had been living in the palace. Then Alan looked around the room as if looking for someone, and the count asked what the prince was looking for, but he did not answer. Rising from the sofa, the prince told him about the only thing that disappointed him in the menu. He pointed to the alcohol that the other guests were drinking. The prince invited the count to taste the drink himself to decide what its quality was. "Why don't you have a glass yet?" Alan teased the count. And when he took the glass of drink, the prince was already tasting victory. The young man used the holy power to make holy water and fill the glass of drink with it. The prince remembered the past events. He was sure that the silhouette in the alley was the count. The boy was already tasting the sweet victory. The count doubted and even got excited. But it was all in vain. The prince's hope was gone. The count drank everything in the glass in one gulp. He said that because he drank it all very quickly, he was already a little drunk. He apologized for his weakness to alcohol. Alan noticed that Fulmer didn't look drunk, and the count replied that he was not drunk yet. The guy could not believe what he saw. It must be some kind of trick, he thought. The counts and ladies were enjoying a beautiful evening and the idol was destroyed by the sound of breaking glass. Finding the cause of the noise, people saw Count Fulmer lying down, and above him stood the prince who had just broken a bottle of alcohol and was holding the remnants of the container as a weapon. The count screamed in horror for the prince to stop, but the man did not respond to the man's pleas. He waved his hand and cut the count's arm with the broken bottle. The man covered the wound with a handkerchief and almost crying asked the prince to calm down. Alan was surprised. He looked at the count's wound and could not believe that it had not healed. Was he mistaken? But despite what he had seen, the prince was still convinced that Thomond was a vampire. Harmon tried to resolve the situation by standing between the prince and the count, apologizing for the prince, saying that he was already drunk and could not be responsible for his actions. And he advised the earl to go to the doctor and have his wound treated, which he agreed to. Charlotte, who had come running, began to ask the boy why he did it, if the prince had felt something strange about the lord. Alan did not drag his feet and said directly that he was almost sure that Lord Fulmer was a vampire. Harmon's first impulse was to rush to catch up, but Alan stopped him. They had little evidence, so the boy ordered him to calm down and give him a sheet of paper and a pen. The knight was curious why the prince needed these supplies, so he asked what they were for. The boy replied that they were going to start hunting for a vampire. In his room, Lord Fulmer began to vomit blood. His mouth caught fire with blue flames, revealing vampire fangs. He began to curse the bastard for realizing who he was, which was the only way to explain why there was holy water in the glass instead of alcohol. Looking at his deplorable condition, the vampire decided to cut out all the damaged organs, and finding new, fresh blood and meat was a priority. At that moment, a knock came from outside the door and the voice of a maid who had come to clean the room, a pleasant surprise that made everything easier. The lord invited the maid inside. The girl apologized for the inconvenience and promised to do everything quickly, but stopped talking when she saw the horrible bloodstains all over the room. The vampire was just waiting for a dish like her. Two maids were walking down the hall and heard a noise. It was Count Fulmer coming out of the room in new clothes and a pleasant smile. He greeted the girls and praised the wonderful dinner. He also wished them not to overwork at the banquet, and the servants took his words well, thinking that he was sincerely concerned about them. He also mentioned a maid named Milla. The count said that she worked so well that he decided to hire her to his estate and ordered the girls to pass the information to the valet. The girls were happy for their friend to be working under a man like Lord Fulmer, and Milla must be happy, but they did not realize that their friend was now in the room in the form of 2 pieces of torn meat. The count closed the door to the room and started to leave, but the maid gently stopped him. She wanted to show him the way to the banquet hall. The man must have gotten lost and the count said that he was going to visit the first prince to tell him the latest news. The prince finally finished writing the nobles on the sheet. And these are only the ones that could be seen from the first floor. Since there was no evidence that they were vampires, the task of catching them was a problem and there were no parents on the list. It made the task of elimination easier. The guy asked Harmon what his words meant and he told him that if a dead person evolves into a vampire, like the count is a vampire from Lonia, he is called a parent. And parents can eventually create descendants. The offspring, in turn, are much weaker than the parents. That's why it's good to have no parents. But it's not so easy, because the descendants specialize in hiding among people, and even the Holy Emperor cannot sense them. Such vampires can replace their bodies with the bodies of the people they killed. The prince immediately recalled a case in the city with a severed head and hanging skin. The prince shared his thoughts with the knight and the boy confirmed what the prince had said and added that vampires do take bodies and leave everything unnecessary, and since most vampire bodies are human, holy water works well on them. The prince asked Harmon how high the knight's position was. and he replied that it was high enough to raise 1 regiment of holy knights. The guy ordered to catch everyone on the list, assess the situation and kill the vampires. The prince was going to take full responsibility and send Charlotte to help Harmond. He did not care about the girl's concerns for his safety. Moving the military force during the banquet. Alan interrupted the knight and told him not to worry about him, but to worry about himself because there was no way to prove that the guests were vampires. And they would have to attack seemingly ordinary people. The prince ordered to punish the offenders and turn them into ashes. The lord, or rather the vampire count, noticed that the prince had found out who he was, so the young man ordered him to hurry or his life would be in danger. Charlotte and Harmond looked at each other. They agreed to follow the boy's order and asked the prince to be careful. The prince was about to cover his aura and hide somewhere when someone called out to him. The man said that it had been a long time since they last met, and the man was the prince's middle brother Raphael Alphals, the third prince, who was 21 years old. Taking a glimpse of his features, Alan wondered with surprise why they were strangely low. However, his attention was drawn to his name. The guy who came in, sympathizing with his memory loss, wanted to say that he was his brother. But our hero, without letting him finish, said he knew he was the third prince. Although there was no information about it in the system window, Alan learned it from Harmond, who had told him about it before. Besides that, he also learned from Harmond that he was Mama's boy, who is even recognized as such by the Holy Emperor. A prince with almost zero presence. While Alan was recalling the information about Raphael, he awkwardly coughed and said he was glad he remembered him. To which our hero replied that he didn't, adding that it was Harmond who had told him about it. Deciding not to dwell on it, Raphael tried to hurt Alan by saying that none of the other brothers had come to the banquet. Then he added that our hero should not be disappointed, because they probably just had something more important to do than a congratulatory banquet. However, his attempts were in vain, as Alan was not the kind of person who could be so easily hurt. Realizing that he was just trying to piss him off, Alan decided to play along, and replied that it was enough that he had come. Hearing this, Raphael smugly replied that he himself had only managed to come because his schedule was free. The next moment, however, his tone changed dramatically. He put his hand on our hero's shoulder and said that he could see that he still liked to destroy everything, as well as to show himself full of useless thoughts. Then he looked at Alan with a cold look and said that if he had come to the imperial palace to try to take the throne, then they could become enemies. Alan didn't say anything, but looked at the hand on his shoulder indifferently. Raphael, seeing that he didn't answer, said that he should just go on living as he had before. Having said that, he immediately said that he had to leave. Alan thought to himself as he watched the third prince leave that he would have no chance of becoming crown prince even if he wasn't here. Deciding to forget about that idiot, he told himself that he should concentrate on what was important. Which was to come up with a plan to expose Fulmer, for there was no telling what he was capable of. So before Harmond and Charlotte finished their work, he should hide and keep a low profile so he wouldn't get into trouble. But it seems that this might not have been destined to happen, for the door to the hall opened abruptly. And the very next moment he heard someone shouting furiously, the owner calling his name and demanding that he come out immediately. Hearing the shout, Alan smiled brokenly. He wondered why when he wanted to be inconspicuous, trouble would find him. Hearing the shouting of the maid, who called the speaker Prince Lawan, begging him to stop and not move so much, Alan turned around. Before his eyes indeed appeared the first prince, Lawan Alphals. There was a gloomy and murderous aura emanating from him that made even Alan shudder. Looking at the information about the prince that was displayed in the system window, our hero noted that he had everything to become the next holy emperor, because in addition to the talent for swordsmanship, he also had the qualities of a wise ruler. Unfortunately for him, however, it was useless, as his cursed rotting body was a problem he couldn't solve. Alan was astonished as he couldn't fully believe that a person with a body that was more like that of a dead man could still be alive. As the system window reported, one of the reasons why the prince's willpower was so strong was that he was determined to punish the person who had dishonored his mother. And unfortunately for the protagonist, that person was him. Abruptly running up and grabbing Alan by the scruff of the neck, one began to shout furiously at him, asking him how he dared to behave like that to the man who served their mother. He also added that he didn't think the man didn't know about it. By this man he meant Earl Fomer, whom Alan had wounded before. The people in the hall watched the scene in silence. However, their presence was not a hindrance to the first prince, who grabbed Alan's collar even tighter and furiously asked why he was always trying to insult the goddess and always opposing him. Not paying attention to the blood that began to come from his mouth, he looked Alan directly in the eyes, with anger in his voice loudly asked why he continues to defame the honor of their mother. At the same time, the Holy Emperor himself entered the hall, who looked at the brothers with a cold gaze and asked what they were doing. Hearing his voice, everyone turned around. However, no one dared not utter a word. Furious that no one had answered him, he repeated his question in a loud voice. Even in the Saint Emperor's voice alone, there was a huge amount of holy power that was directed at Alan and Luan. As it turned out, it was too much for the first prince, and he immediately started coughing up blood. Seeing this, the Holy Emperor immediately ordered the Archbishop to take the first prince away and start treating him. He went to Alan and told him to explain what had happened, and asked him if he had really insulted the Earl of Fomer. Without hiding anything, he immediately replied that it was true. Hearing this, the Holy Emperor asked what was the reason for this behavior. Alan didn't know what to say, but he couldn't say that he was going to hunt the Count either. Besides, he didn't know if he should have openly stated that Count Fomer was a vampire. However, when he looked at the cold face of the Holy Emperor, he realized that he simply wouldn't believe him. Therefore, he had no choice but to reply that he had drunk a little too much and made a mistake. After hearing this, the Emperor looked at him incredulously and asked if he was telling the truth. Alan was not particularly happy about this reaction, as he realized that the Emperor didn't really believe what he said and still expected him to answer differently. However, he couldn't tell the truth now, so he answered that there was no other reason. At the same time, the first prince, who had been treated a little, began to struggle to get to his feet. Angrily telling everyone to get out of his way, he sharply grabbed a glass from the table. Then he threw it at Alan with all his might. But the glass never reached its target. The Holy Emperor was furious at this insolent behavior and asked Luan how he dared to behave in his presence. He apologized for his rudeness and replied that his subordinate had been humiliated. And since he was not going to let it go, he asked him for permission to spar with Alan. Hearing the first prince's words, the Holy Emperor asked how he was going to fight in such a state. He turned around to leave and added that he would discipline him after the trial, but until then, he advised Luan to return to his quarters. He disagreed, however, and said that he had heard that he had confided in Alan about the situation in Lonia. Then asking if he let Alan spar with by him, don't he think he will be able to see his true self? Pointing to our hero who was listening silently, he turned to the Emperor and asked if he thought Alan was capable of killing a vampire, or if he was just taking credit. Looking at the Emperor, Luan asked again if he really didn't want to know if he was capable of doing anything. The Archbishop tried to reason with the Holy Emperor, saying that it would be dangerous for the body of the first prince. However, he turned around and headed for the exit without answering. Under the shouts of the Archbishop who was trying to change the Emperor's mind, Luan turned to Alan and said that the Emperor had approved of their sparring. Then, with a smile, he pointed his finger at him and added that he was sure to beat the nerve out of him, and that he had better be prepared. Alan looked at him emotionlessly and thought to himself that no one seemed to be interested in his opinion about this fight.